The runway lights cut through the night like a string of stars, guiding an aircraft to its final descent. But what if that aircraft was never meant to be there? What if it had taken off decades earlier, vanished into thin air and reappeared as though time itself had bent around it? This is not simply a tale of mechanical failure or human error. These are the stories that defy the very laws of physics, accounts of planes that disappeared without a trace only to return years, sometimes generations later, as if plucked from another dimension and set back down in our world. To imagine sitting in a control tower watching a silent dot appear on radar, then seeing an aged aircraft touch down as if no time had passed, is to glimpse the unsettling edge between fact and legend. And it is here, at this razor's edge, that our journey begins. Aviation has always been a marriage of science and daring. From the Wright brothers' fragile wooden flyer in 1903 to the steel giants that now cross oceans in hours, the story of human flight is written in equal parts triumph and tragedy. The early years of flight were particularly perilous. Weather forecasts were unreliable, navigation relied on crude instruments, and radio communication was in its infancy. Pilots took to the skies knowing that one wrong calculation, one sudden storm, or one failed engine could mean disaster. Against that backdrop, disappearances were not uncommon. Entire squadrons went missing during training exercises. Civilian flights vanished over the oceans. Cargo planes were swallowed by storms. Most of these incidents had explanations, however tragic, but a smaller number of cases seemed to break all logic. These were the flights that not only vanished but reappeared, sometimes decades later, carrying with them a mystery that refuses to be solved. They are called ghost flights. Some say they are fabrications born of rumour and journalistic embellishment. Others argue they are glimpses into time slips, moments where our world collides with another, where the rules of physics yield to something stranger. The persistence of these accounts across cultures and decades suggests something more than coincidence. The 20th century, with its wars and expanding skies, became fertile ground for such stories. Air travel was still new enough to feel magical, yet old enough to inspire faith in its permanence. When a plane vanished, it struck at the heart of that faith. Families waited at terminals for loved ones who never arrived. Radio silence stretched into weeks, then months. Wreckage was sometimes found. Torn wings, charred fuselages, but not always. And in those gaps, in those haunting absences, the idea of ghost flights grew. The most famous tales often begin in routine fashion. A passenger aircraft leaves New York, Havana or Rio, its engine steady, its crew calm. Hours pass, then radio contact fails. Search efforts sweep the skies and seas but find nothing. Official reports eventually declare the plane lost. Decades roll by. Then out of nowhere, an outdated craft appears on airport approach, its paint faded, its call signs decades out of date. Witnesses claim to see passengers in period clothing staring through the windows. Sometimes the plane lands safely, its crew bewildered, insisting only hours have passed. In other versions, the cabin is filled with skeletons, frozen in their seats. Both kinds of stories raise the same question. How could a machine and its people leap across time and reappear long after history had written them off? Skeptics point to folklore's tendency to adapt old fears into new forms. In earlier centuries, ships were said to vanish into mists only to return years later. Barnacles clinging to their hulls, crew missing or long dead. The Flying Dutchman haunted sailors just as ghost flights now haunt aviators. But the difference lies in the technological record. Planes file flight plans, towers record radar data, airports log landings. Some ghost flight tales are tied to actual documented disappearances, giving them a strange weight that legends alone rarely achieve. To grasp why these stories persist, one must also understand the cultural backdrop of the mid-1900s. This was the era of the Bermuda Triangle, when countless books and documentaries claimed the Atlantic was swallowing ships and planes. It was the Cold War era when secrecy-cloaked accidents and rumours filled the void. A missing plane might be explained as espionage gone wrong, a hijacking covered up, or a test flight buried under classified files. Into this atmosphere, ghost flight accounts slid neatly, offering explanations beyond the mundane. Where governments refused to speak, folklore whispered about rifts in time. Perhaps the most unnerving element of these stories is the human touch. Families of the lost often reported strange encounters. A daughter receiving a letter postmarked years after her father's disappearance written in his handwriting. A control tower operator swearing that the voice on the radio was that of a pilot long declared dead. Airport staff describing the acrid smell of old fuel, the rattle of outdated engines, the sheer impossibility of watching history taxi down a runway. These are not vague myths told in bars. They are narratives tethered to places, names, and sometimes official logs. And so the legend of ghost flights endures. They represent more than aviation accidents. They force us to confront deeper questions. What if time is not a straight line? What if the sky itself hides corridors that swallow the unwary and return them when no one remembers their names? Science offers no proof, only shrugs. Folklore offers too much, crowding the stories with fantasy. But the core remains. Airplanes, real machines built of steel and rivets, disappearing into nothing and returning decades later. In this series, we will travel across continents and decades, revisiting the most compelling of these cases. From the Bermuda Triangle's vanishing squadrons to the eerie landing of Pan Am Flight 914, from Cold War skies to South American jungles, we will sift through witness testimony, newspaper archives, and aviation lore. Some of these stories will tilt toward fact, others toward myth. Yet all share the same unsettling theme: that flight, mankind's great triumph over gravity, may not be as secure as we believe. As the engines of a ghost flight roar back to life on a forgotten runway, the question is not whether the story is true. The question is why, after so many decades, we still feel the chill of possibility when we hear it. Because deep down we know the sky is vast, time is fragile, and sometimes history takes a detour it never explains. The early decades of aviation were an age of marvel and fear in equal measure. For the first time in human history, ordinary men and women could leave the ground and rise into the heavens, their lives suspended between earth and sky. Yet every ascent carried with it an unspoken gamble. Engines were fragile, instruments primitive, and weather unpredictable. To board a plane in the 1920s or 1930s was to step into a new frontier where the promise of swift travel was shadowed by the ever-present possibility of vanishing altogether. Against this backdrop, the stage was set for stories that would later be remembered not as mere accidents but as ghostly vanishings, strange disappearances that hinted at something beyond mechanical failure. The development of aviation in the first half of the 20th century was astonishingly rapid. In just a single generation, humanity leapt from the Wright brothers' wooden contraption at Kitty Hawk to massive transatlantic airliners. Air routes expanded it across continents, binding nations together with threads of flight. But every mile gained came at the cost of risk. Pilots navigated using the stars, magnetic compasses, and dead reckoning. A clouded sky or a drifting error could turn a straight course into a deadly spiral. Radios existed, but were often unreliable, especially over long stretches of ocean or mountain. If a plane lost its way, there was no GPS to guide it home, no satellite network to pinpoint its distress. And yet, it wasn't only the fragility of technology that fueled the age of disappearance. It was the isolation of the skies themselves. A shipwreck could leave survivors clinging to wreckage, spotted by passing vessels. A lost caravan might be found by trackers in the desert. But a missing aircraft could vanish into mountain crags, deep jungle canopies, or ocean-dammed depths that swallowed every trace. In these places, silence was absolute. Families waited at airports, scanning arrival boards, their loved ones' names growing colder with each passing hour. Officials issued bulletins, searches fanned out, and headlines declared, "Flight missing." Days later, when no wreckage was found, the disappearance entered another category entirely, the realm of myth. The interwar period was especially rich with such vanishings. Amelia Earhart's final flight in 1937 became the most famous, though hers was only one among many. Dozens of pioneering aviators vanished in attempts to set records, cross oceans, or chart new routes. What made their stories endure was not just the lack of closure, but the uncanny way some of them echoed one another. Engines sputtering into static-filled radios, final transmissions cut short, sightings of planes in places they should not have been. Each report added a layer to a growing sense that the sky itself might sometimes hold its secrets tight. During World War II, the scale of aviation expanded dramatically, and with it, the number of planes that simply disappeared. Vast stretches of ocean became battlegrounds where thousands of aircraft went missing without explanation. The Pacific in particular seemed to consume them whole. Pilots trained in navigation still found themselves lost, entire squadrons vanishing without trace. In such an environment, ghost flight stories were almost inevitable. For families desperate for answers, the notion that their loved ones' planes had not crashed but slipped into some other place, only to return later, offered a strange kind of comfort. But beyond comfort, there was also unease. Airports and military bases began to log unusual occurrences, phantom blips on radar, unidentified aircraft resembling older models landing without warning, pilots reporting seeing planes in mid-air that should have been long retired. Most of these were dismissed as equipment failure or misidentification. Yet the persistence of the accounts, recorded across continents and decades, suggests something more than faulty instruments. The post-war years brought new hope. Commercial aviation boomed, safety improved, and air travel began to lose its aura of danger. But even as technology advanced, the tales of ghost flights did not fade. Instead, they became sharper, more unsettling, because they occurred in an age when such disappearances should have been impossible. A passenger aircraft in full view of radar should not simply vanish. A decades-old plane should not touch down in an era of jets and glass cockpits. And yet, according to witnesses, that is exactly what happened. The age of disappearance was more than a historical phase of lost flights. It was a psychological landscape where human imagination, grief, and wonder collided with the unknown. To those who lived through it, the sky was no longer merely blue air above their heads. It was a realm that could open and close at will, swallowing people whole or spitting them back out after decades had passed. Science would attempt explanations, navigational errors, storms, structural failures, but the stories of ghost flights resisted such neat conclusions. And so a pattern emerged. Whenever a plane vanished, the public clung to the possibility that it had not been destroyed, but had slipped sideways into time itself. The mystery was not simply why these flights disappeared, but why some seemed to return, carrying with them the heavy silence of years lost. For every rational theory, there remained the haunting image of a long-forgotten aircraft descending toward a modern runway, its engines coughing, its crew staring blankly as though no time had passed at all. The age of disappearance gave birth to the first true legends of ghost flights. They would echo in hangars, in pilot bars, and in the hushed voices of families who refused to accept loss without trace. Each vanished plane became more than an accident. It became part of a growing folklore of skies that could not be trusted to obey the rules of man or machine. And it is from this age, rich with both tragedy and myth, that the most famous cases of ghost flights would soon emerge. December 5th, 1945 was an ordinary training day for the United States Navy. At the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station in Florida, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers prepared for a routine navigation exercise over the Atlantic. The weather was clear, the sea calm, and the mission straightforward. These were not raw recruits, but pilots with wartime experience, tasked with honing their skills in overwater flying. None could have imagined that within hours their squadron would vanish into history, leaving behind one of the most enduring aviation mysteries of all time. The disappearance of Flight 19 would become the cornerstone of the Bermuda Triangle legend, a tale of compasses gone mad, radio transmissions filled with dread, an aircraft swallowed by the sky itself. The mission, known as Navigation Problem Number 1, called for the 5 Avengers to fly east from Florida, practice bombing runs near the Bahamas, then turn north before looping back to base. Each plane was fully fueled and in good condition, and the total flight time was expected to be around 3 hours. At the helm was Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, an experienced naval aviator who had fought in the Pacific. He was considered capable and reliable, though some reports later suggested he was unfamiliar with the Florida-Bahamas area. Still, no unexpected complications. At first, everything proceeded according to plan. The squadron carried out its bombing practice successfully, but as they turned northward, trouble began to surface. At around 3:40 p.m, radio operators on the ground received a troubling transmission. Taylor's voice came through tight with concern. "Both my compasses are out, and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." The words carried confusion, as if the world itself had shifted beneath him. The problem was geography. Taylor believed he was flying over the Florida Keys, the chain of islands stretching south of the peninsula, but in fact, he and his men were east of Florida, over the Bahamas. Misidentifying his location, Taylor led the squadron on a fateful course. Believing he was over the Keys, he turned northeast, hoping to reach Florida's east coast. In reality, he was steering his squadron farther out into the Atlantic, For the next 3 hours, radio operators tried desperately to correct Taylor's navigation. They urged him to fly west. Any westward heading would eventually bring him to the Florida coastline. But Taylor hesitated, uncertain of his position. His transmissions grew increasingly frantic. "We can't tell where we are. Everything looks strange, and even the ocean." Later transmissions from his men betrayed their growing despair. One voice was heard saying, "If we just headed west, we'd get home." But Taylor, as flight leader, held authority. As the sun set, the squadron was still hopelessly lost. Fuel began to run low. At around 7:30 p.m, a final transmission was heard. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." After that, silence. The 5 Avengers and their 14 crewmen disappeared into the darkness. Despite one of the largest air and sea searches in history, no wreckage was ever found. The tragedy deepened hours later when a PBM Mariner rescue plane dispatched to search for Flight 19 also vanished, along with its 13 crew members. Witnesses reported seeing a fireball in the sky, suggesting the Mariner may have exploded in mid-air, but no trace of it was recovered. The disappearance of the rescue plane so soon after Flight 19 only added to the sense of something uncanny at work in the region. In the official Navy report, the cause of Flight 19's disappearance was listed as causes or reasons unknown. Though later reviews blamed Taylor's navigational errors, the mystery endured. How could 5 aircraft, even if lost, vanish without leaving a trace? How could no wreckage be found in the shallow waters of the Bahamas and the Atlantic coast? These unanswered questions opened the door to speculation far beyond simple error. The Bermuda Triangle legend grew in the decades that followed, with writers and broadcasters pointing to Flight 19 as proof of a supernatural or interdimensional phenomenon. They highlighted Taylor's baffling words about the ocean looking strange, about compasses spinning wildly, about the squadron's collective confusion. To them, this was not merely disorientation, it was evidence of something extraordinary, a time slip or spatial rift that swallowed the aircraft whole. Skeptics argue that Flight 19 was simply a tragic case of human error compounded by bad luck. Taylor's misidentification of his position, combined with his insistence on flying northeast instead of west, doomed the squadron to run out of fuel over open water. The lack of wreckage, they say, is unsurprising in the vast ocean. Yet even skeptics admit that the eerie radio transmissions and the vanishing of the rescue plane make this more than a typical accident. For those who lived through it, the disappearance was devastating. Families of the 27 lost men were left without closure, their loved ones swallowed by an ocean that refused to give back its dead. For the Navy, it was a reminder of the dangers of navigation in the pre-GPS era. But for the wider world, Flight 19 became something larger, a symbol of the sky's hidden dangers, of the possibility that the world contains folds and corridors we cannot explain. Today, nearly 80 years later, the story of Flight 19 still captures the imagination. The planes remain missing, their final resting place unknown, and in the silence of that absence, the Bermuda Triangle legend continues to breathe. For some, Flight 19 is a story of poor judgment. For others, it is the ultimate ghost flight, a squadron lost to time itself. Whatever the truth, its enigma marks the beginning of an era where the sky was no longer simply a path of air, but a threshold into mystery. It was a clear morning in Caracas, Venezuela, in 1992 when air traffic controllers at Maiquetía International Airport picked up an unusual signal. On their screens appeared a radar blip of an incoming aircraft, standard enough except for one strange detail. The plane's transponder identified it as a Douglas DC-3, a model long retired from commercial service. Controllers assumed it was a private vintage craft, perhaps flown for nostalgia or exhibition. But as the aircraft drew closer, its age became undeniable. Through binoculars, tower staff saw its faded paint, its propellers churning slowly, and its windows lined with passengers dressed not for the 1990s, but for a time decades earlier. When the plane landed and taxied to the terminal, the story of DC-3 Flight 914 was about to unfold, one of the most chilling ghost flight legends of the 20th century. The tale begins in 1955. According to reports, Flight 914 departed New York bound for Miami, Florida. On board were 57 passengers and a crew of 4. The weather was clear, the engines freshly serviced, and the trip should have taken no more than a few hours. Yet somewhere over the Atlantic coast, the aircraft vanished. Radio contact ceased, radar failed to track it, and searches along the route turned up nothing. After weeks of scouring both sea and land, authorities declared the flight lost. Families grieved, memorials were held, and life moved on. But the mystery of Flight 914 did not end there. Nearly 4 decades later, on that morning in Caracas, the same DC-3 allegedly descended from the skies, its engines sputtering as though they had aged in real time. Ground crew rushed to meet it, beatiz and confused by its appearance. Witnesses later claimed that the pilot opened his cockpit window and shouted, "Where are we?" What year is this? When told it was May 21st, 1992, he and his passengers were stunned. According to the story, the pilot tossed a bundle of outdated flight charts onto the tarmac before quickly throttling up the engines. Despite the frantic protests of ground staff, the DC-3 turned sharply and roared back into the sky, disappearing once more into legend. No official records confirm this event. The story surfaced through sensational magazines and paranormal broadcasts, spreading rapidly across Latin America and beyond. Photographs were even circulated, some showing a DC-3 on a Venezuelan runway, others depicting yellowed flight documents supposedly linked to the mysterious arrival. Whether fabricated or embellished, these images gave the tale a sense of authenticity that facts alone could not provide. People wanted to believe that an aircraft could slip through time and return decades later, its passengers unaged, its crew bewildered. The fascination with Flight 914 lies in its plausibility. Unlike tales of vanishing squadrons over the Bermuda Triangle, this was a civilian flight on a routine route. Families were waiting at the Miami terminal in 1955, and the DC-3 was a common, trusted aircraft of its era. The sudden leap from ordinary tragedy to supernatural possibility captured the imagination of millions. Could a plane truly pass into another dimension, skipping 37 years as effortlessly as a stone skips across water? The lack of wreckage, the silence of official records, and the strangeness of the reappearance combined to make the legend irresistible. Skeptics, of course, have their explanations. Many argue that the story of Flight 914 was born not in radar towers or runways, but in the pages of tabloid magazines. In the 1980s and 1990s, sensational stories of time slips, UFO encounters, and supernatural phenomena filled cheap print. The DC-3 tale fit perfectly into this trend. Researchers who traced the origins of the legend found that much of it stemmed from recurring features in paranormal weeklies, often with altered details each time. In some versions, the plane landed in Caracas. In others, it touched down in Mexico or even in Florida itself, before disappearing again. And yet, dismissing the story as mere invention overlooks its cultural power. The legend of Flight 914 endures not because of evidence, but because of the questions it raises. Why do we find such stories compelling? Perhaps it is because they strike at the fragile trust we place in time and technology. Air travel is meant to be precise, scheduled down to the minute, guided by instruments, bound by laws of physics. When a plane defies all of that, it reminds us that control is an illusion. The DC-3 was itself a symbol of aviation's golden age. Rugged, reliable, and iconic, it carried soldiers during the war and tourists in peacetime. To imagine such a plane crossing not just skies but decades transforms it into something more than a machine. It becomes a vessel of myth, a chariot ferrying souls across the boundaries of time. That is why, even today, stories of Flight 914 resurface on television specials, in internet forums, and in whispered conversations between believers. For families of real aviation disasters, these stories offer a bittersweet echo. The idea that a lost plane might one day return passengers intact is a dream of closure that reality denies. But there is also dread in the thought. What if those aboard know nothing of the years that passed, stepping off their plane into a world unrecognizable? Would such a return be salvation or another kind of tragedy? Whether true or not, the Caracas arrival of Flight 914 has become one of the defining ghost flight legends of modern times. It teaches us less about physics than about belief, less about navigation than about the human hunger for mystery. We may never know whether a DC-3 truly descended onto Venezuelan soil in 1992, its crew shouting in confusion at the year. What we do know is that the story lives on, refusing to fade, much like the ghostly echo of propellers in a sky where time itself sometimes seems to lose its way. The Andes Mountains have long been both a cradle and a tomb for aviation. Their jagged peaks rise suddenly from the plains, their weather turns in minutes, and their vast stretches of snow conceal what falls within them for decades at a time. In Chile, this landscape birthed one of South America's most unsettling aviation legends, a story that began with a routine domestic flight in 1956 and ended, decades later, with whispers of a phantom reappearance. Known as LAN Chile Flight 210, it is remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a ghost flight whose echoes still trouble the memory of Santiago's skies. On April 3, 1956, Flight 210 departed Santiago bound for the southern city of Osorno. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-3, reliable and respected, carrying 20 passengers and 4 crew members. It was a clear morning and the route over the Andes was familiar to the pilots. Families waved their goodbyes at the terminal, expecting only a short domestic journey. But somewhere amid the clouds and ridges, the aircraft vanished. No distress signal was received. No crash site was reported. The plane had simply melted into the vast silence of the mountains. The Chilean Air Force launched search operations within hours. For days, squadrons combed the rugged passes, following the expected flight path. They found nothing. Reports of smoke in distant valleys or glints of metal on snowy ridges led to false hopes, each fading as quickly as it came. The search was eventually called off, the official conclusion being that the DC-3 had gone down somewhere in the Andes, its wreckage hidden by silhouette of snow. Families mourned, but the lack of a body, a wing, or even a scrap of luggage left the wound open. For years, Flight 210 remained one of many unsolved disappearances in aviation's mid-century record, but the story did not end in silence. In the late 1980s, a rumour spread through Santiago's aviation community. A DC-3 had appeared unexpectedly on airport radar. Controllers claimed to have seen it circling an old formation, transponder codes dating back to the 1950s. Some insisted they watched as the aircraft approached the runway, its engines droning weakly. Yet when they sent out ground crews to meet it, nothing was there. The runway was empty, the radar echo gone. These claims spread quickly, retold in newspapers and late-night radio broadcasts. Witnesses described the craft in eerie detail, its livery faded but recognizable, its propellers out of sync, its radio transmission static, laced, and incomprehensible. A few swore they saw figures through the windows, passengers in period dress staring blankly into the night. Was it the ghost of Flight 210, returning 3 decades too late? Or was it a trick of radar, a glitch amplified by the weight of memory? Skeptics dismissed the story as folklore. They pointed out that in 1965, nearly a decade after its disappearance, climbers in the Andes had stumbled upon wreckage believed to belong to Flight 210. Twisted metal, broken propellers, and fragments of human remains were found, confirming that the plane had indeed gone down in the mountains. Official records list the crash site near Cerro El Plomo, north of Santiago. From this perspective, there was no mystery, just a tragic crash and delayed discovery. But the folklore refused to die. Those who had lost relatives in the disaster argued that the wreckage did not account for all passengers, that certain details of the site did not match the flight's expected course. Others clung to the radar accounts from the 1980s, insisting that too many people had witnessed the phantom arrival for it to be dismissed as the imagination. Some even believed the plane had crossed into another dimension that day in 1956, only to reappear sporadically in later decades, trapped between worlds. The legend of Flight 210 became a cultural mirror for Chile itself. In a nation accustomed to earthquakes, mountain tragedies, and political disappearances, the image of a lost aircraft returning without explanation struck a deep chord. Families imagined passengers stepping off decades later, bewildered to find the world changed. Stories circulated of luggage found with pristine documents inside, as though preserved in another realm. A few spoke of strange calls, crackling voices over radio frequencies long abandoned, identifying themselves as crew of a flight that had never arrived. What makes the tale endure is its mixture of fact and myth. The wreckage was real, but so were the later radar reports, logged by controllers who had no reason to invent them. Between those poles lies the mystery. Could mountain winds and radar interference create ghost images? Certainly. Could folklore shape memory until radar blips were mistaken for phantoms? Possibly. But could time itself bend, carrying an aircraft decades forward before releasing it into the present? That is what keeps the story alive in whispers. Aviation historians often compare Flight 210 to other ghost flight legends, such as Pan Am Flight 914, or Brazil's infamous Flight 513. What they share is not proof but resonance. These stories linger because they speak to the human fear of vanishing without trace, and the equally powerful hope that the lost are not truly gone, but simply misplaced in time. In the case of Chile, a country where the Andes loom like guardians over daily life, the idea that the mountains themselves could withhold and then return what they claimed fits naturally into cultural imagination. Today, travellers flying into Santiago may look out their windows at the jagged ridges and remember the story of Flight 210. Pilots passing Cerro El Plomo sometimes joke about seeing old DC-3s drifting through the clouds. And late at night, when static creeps across the radio, a few still claim to hear voices calling from a flight declared lost nearly 70 years ago. The Phantom of Santiago is more than a vanished plane. It is a reminder that the Andes guard their secrets well, that some disappearances are never fully explained, and that every radar blip in the dark sky carries with it the possibility of history trying once more to land. It was July 2nd, 1955, and New York's LaGuardia Airport bustled with the familiar rhythm of summer travel. Among the many planes scheduled to depart that day was Pan American Flight 914, a Douglas DC-4 bound for Miami. On board were 57 passengers and a crew of 4, families in holiday attire, businessmen carrying briefcases, and stewardesses moving with cheerful efficiency. The flight plan was routine, just under 3 hours south along the eastern seaboard. But as the clock struck 9:55 a.m. and the aircraft lifted from the runway, no one could have guessed that this flight would become one of the strangest and most enduring mysteries in aviation lore. For a time, everything seemed ordinary. The plane's engines droned steadily as it made its way into the sky. Passengers settled in for the short trip, unaware that history was about to swallow them whole. Somewhere between New York and Miami, communication ceased. Radio operators received no distress calls. Radar showed no unusual deviations. The plane simply disappeared. Search parties scoured the coastline. Rescue operations extended over the Atlantic, and reports were filed. Weeks passed, then months, and finally the authorities declared Flight 914 lost, its passengers presumed dead. Grief-stricken families held funerals without bodies. For the world, it was another aviation tragedy, until nearly 4 decades later, when the impossible allegedly happened. On March 9, 1985, air traffic controllers in Caracas, Venezuela, reported a strange occurrence. A radar blip appeared suddenly in their airspace, an unidentified plane descending toward the airport without warning or clearance. The control tower quickly established contact, and the pilot's voice, calm but confused, came across the radio. "This is Pan American Flight 914 from New York to Miami. Scheduled arrival July 2nd, 1955. The words stunned the controllers. Pan Am had long since ceased operations. The year was 1985, not 1955. Yet here was a pilot identifying himself as though 3 lost decades had never passed. According to the legend, the plane descended smoothly and taxied along the runway, its propellers still spinning, its fuselage showing no signs of wear beyond what would have been expected in 1955. Ground crews claimed they saw passengers pressed against the windows, their clothing and hairstyles distinctly outdated. When the pilot was informed of the date, he reportedly panicked, shouting, "Oh my God!" before abruptly starting the engines again. The DC-4 turned back toward the runway, gathered speed and lifted off. In minutes it had disappeared once more into the sky, leaving behind only confusion, and some claimed scattered documents thrown onto the tarmac, yellowed flight manifests dated July 1955. The story spread quickly, first through sensationalist newspapers, then through radio shows and eventually television. It became one of the most frequently cited examples of a ghost flight, retold across continents in multiple languages. For many, the details were too striking to dismiss. The shocked pilot, the bewildered passengers, the physical evidence of flight documents. It seemed less like rumour and more like proof that time itself could bend, releasing a lost plane decades later as if no time had passed for those inside. Skeptics, however, were quick to point out inconsistencies. No official Pan Am records mention a Flight 914 vanishing in 1955. Aviation historians found no corroborating evidence in government files or accident reports. The story's earliest appearances traced back to tabloid magazines that specialised in the sensational. Over time, the tale was embellished. Sometimes the reappearance was said to occur in Caracas, other times in Mexico or Florida. The documents shown as evidence were likely staged for dramatic effect. To many researchers, Flight 914 was a legend born from pulp reporting, not reality. And yet the legend persisted. Why? Because it tapped into something deeper than fact. The idea of a plane slipping through time resonates with the same primal unease that once fueled tales of ghost ships adrift at sea. It reminds us that technology, however advanced, is not immune to the unknown. Flight 914 is compelling because it feels like it could happen. The DC-4 was a real aircraft. Pan Am was a real airline. Families in the 1950s really did wave goodbye at terminals expecting to reunite hours later. When the story is told, listeners can picture themselves in those seats, sipping coffee, reading newspapers, never suspecting that their next destination might be decades in the future. Psychologists argue that such stories endure because they reflect our fragile trust in time. Air travel is built on precision, schedules, timetables, calculations. When a plane reappears 30 years late, that trust collapses. The myth of Flight 914 forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that time is not as fixed as we believe. What if entire lives can be swallowed by a wrinkle in the air? What if loved ones, long mourned, are still out there, circling unseen in skies where clocks run differently? In Caracas, the story of Pan Am Flight 914 has become part of local lore. Taxi drivers recount it to tourists. Elderly residents swear they heard the broadcast from the control tower. Even if documents fail to prove it, memory and belief have kept the legend alive. Ghost flights are not about proof, they are about the questions they leave behind. Did Flight 914 vanish into another dimension? Did it slip into a corridor of time, emerging 30 years later unchanged? Or was it nothing more than a story told and retold until it became indistinguishable from fact? Today, the tale of Flight 914 stands beside Flight 19 and other great mysteries of the skies as one of aviation's most enduring ghost stories. Whether one views it as a hoax or as evidence of something unexplainable, it continues to capture the imagination. For the families who lost loved ones on real flights that vanished without a trace, the story is bittersweet. It offers a strange hope that disappearance does not always mean destruction, that the lost may yet return, but it also stirs unease. For what kind of world would they return to, stepping out of a cabin decades too late? Pan Am Flight 914 may never be proven real, but its place in the pantheon of ghost flights is secure. It reminds us that the skies hold secrets still, that even in an age of satellites and global networks, the possibility of vanishing and perhaps returning cannot be fully dismissed. Somewhere between New York, Miami and Caracas, the echo of propellers lingers, whispering across time, a reminder that sometimes history takes detours that no chart can map. In the early summer of 1961, Havana's José Martí International Airport was alive with the energy of a country in transition. Cuba was only 2 years into its revolution, its skies buzzing with the mixed traffic of old propeller planes and newer jets arriving from Europe and the Americas. Among those scheduled for departure on a seemingly ordinary day was a Cuban Airlines flight bound for Miami, a short hop across the Florida Straits that should have taken less than an hour. The passengers were a mix of businessmen, families and students. For them it was routine travel, but this flight would soon be whispered about not as a simple journey, but as a legend, a plane that vanished into the clouds only to land 37 years later in Mexico. Unchanged, its passengers staring out in confusion as though not a minute had passed. The story, retold countless times in magazines, radio broadcasts and conversations across Latin America, begins innocently enough. The aircraft, a twin-engine Douglas, departed Havana shortly before noon. Weather reports showed clear skies and calm winds. For the first 20 minutes, radio contact was steady. Then silence. Control towers in Havana and Miami called repeatedly, but no response came. Radar screens showed the plane's blip fade into nothing, as if it had been erased mid-flight. Both Cuban and American authorities initiated searches across the straits, deploying boats and reconnaissance planes. Nothing was found, no debris, no oil slick, no bodies. The flight had simply vanished. For decades, it was remembered as one of many tragedies of that turbulent era. Families mourned in silence, holding onto photographs and unclaimed suitcases. In Cuba, the official record quietly listed the plane as lost. In the United States, it was treated as another Cold War-era incident, overshadowed by greater political storms. But in 1998, the legend took a chilling turn. That year, Mexican airport authorities in Veracruz reportedly logged an unscheduled incoming flight. On radar, it appeared suddenly, as if from nowhere. As the craft descended, controllers saw with shock that it was an outdated Douglas aircraft, bearing the faded markings of Cubana de Aviación. Witnesses claimed the plane landed smoothly and taxied toward a remote section of the runway. Airport staff rushed to meet it, expecting perhaps a private collector's antique, but what they saw instead stunned them. The passengers pressed against the windows wore clothing from the early 1960s. Men in narrow ties and short-brimmed hats, women in bright dresses and white gloves. The crew, equally bewildered, insisted they were en route to Miami and demanded to know why they had been diverted to Mexico. When informed it was 1998, not 1961, panic spread through the cabin. According to the accounts that circulated afterward, the pilot refused to disembark. He restarted the engines and, before authorities could intervene, the aircraft turned and roared down the runway. Within minutes, it had lifted off again, disappearing into the clouds as abruptly as it had arrived. No radar tracked its departure. No trace of it was found. It was as though history had briefly reopened a door and then slammed it shut. Skeptics are quick to note that no official documentation confirms the 1998 Veracruz landing. No photographs survive, and many of the details stem from sensationalist newspapers that thrived on tales of the paranormal. Aviation authorities in Mexico deny the incident occurred, pointing out that an unscheduled foreign landing would have generated reams of paperwork. And yet, the story refuses to die. In Cuba and Mexico alike, people still whisper of the Havana ghost flight, insisting that radar logs and tower recordings were buried to avoid panic. Why does this legend endure? Part of the answer lies in its timing. The early 1960s were years of immense upheaval in Cuba. Families were divided between Havana and Miami, with relatives cut off by politics and distance. The idea of a lost plane reappearing decades later, its passengers untouched by time, resonates deeply with those who lived through that separation. It is less a story about aviation than about longing for a past that can never return, for reunions that were denied by history. At the same time, the tale fits neatly into the broader category of ghost flights that defy logic. Like Pan Am Flight 914 and Brazil's Flight 513, the Havana flight challenges our trust in time itself. These stories fascinate because they break the unbreakable, the linear march of hours and years. To imagine passengers stepping off in 1998, clutching 1961 newspapers, and speaking of Kennedy and Khrushchev as though they were still alive, is to confront the fragility of our assumptions about the world. Scientists and skeptics propose explanations rooted in psychology and folklore. They argue that such stories often arise in cultures grappling with loss, offering a supernatural form of closure when reality provides none. A vanished plane becomes not just a tragedy but a myth of survival. Radar glitches, misidentified aircraft, and urban legends fill in the gaps. And yet those who swear by the story insist that too many witnesses could not have been mistaken, that something truly uncanny touched Veracruz that day. Whether real or imagined, the Havana ghost flight reveals something profound about how we process mystery. Human beings cannot bear the finality of vanishing. We crave endings, whether tragic or miraculous. A plane lost forever is too bleak. A plane returning after decades offers drama, horror, and hope all at once. It is a reminder that the sky above us is not only a route between cities, but also a stage where the unimaginable sometimes plays out. To this day, families still light candles in Havana for those lost in 1961. Some do it in mourning, others do it in hope, whispering that perhaps their loved ones are not gone, merely delayed, still circling somewhere in a sky where time runs differently. The Havana flight may never be proven, but its legend stands among the great ghost stories of aviation, a tale where grief, politics, and the mysteries of time converge on a single vanished aircraft. And in the stillness of night, when the clouds drift low over the Straits of Florida, some swear they still hear the faint hum of old propellers, carrying voices from a journey that never truly ended. The World War II transport that returned after the war. The Second World War scattered men and machines across every corner of the globe, and in its aftermath, countless families were left without answers. Ships vanished beneath waves, squadrons disappeared into storms, and transport planes filled with young soldiers never arrived at their destinations. Most of these stories ended in silence, the missing declared lost, their remains buried by jungle, sea, or ice. But among these tragedies emerged a legend that refuses to fade. The tale of a US Army transport that vanished during the war, only to reappear years later as though time had paused somewhere between departure and arrival. The story begins in 1944, when the Allies were shifting vast numbers of men and supplies across the Pacific. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a military workhorse, was one of the most reliable aircraft of the era. Nicknamed the Goonie Bird, it hauled cargo, paratroopers, and wounded alike. On a humid August day, one such C-47 lifted off from an island base in the South Pacific carrying 24 servicemen bound for another staging point. The skies were clear, the route familiar, and the flight should have taken just a few hours. Yet somewhere over the endless ocean, the transport vanished. Radio logs recorded its last transmission, a routine check-in confirming all was well. Minutes later, silence. Search planes flew grid patterns across hundreds of miles of sea, but no debris was found. The men were declared missing in action. For their families back home, telegrams brought grief but little closure. Their names were added to long lists of the missing, swallowed by the chaos of war. But the story took an uncanny turn years later. According to accounts that surfaced in the early 1950s, radar operators at a remote American airfield in the Pacific were startled by the sudden appearance of a blip. No flights were scheduled in that sector. As they watched, an aircraft came into view, a weathered C-47, its markings faded, its engines sputtering but intact. When the plane landed, ground crew rushed forward, expecting to greet weary but living soldiers. Instead, they were met with silence. The transport's cabin was filled with uniformed men sitting rigidly in their seats, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They were dead, but eerily preserved as though the passage of years had not touched them. The details vary depending on who tells the story. Some versions say the plane landed in the Philippines, others in Guam. A few claim the crew was still alive, dazed, and insisting it was still 1944, but the central motif remains the same. A wartime transport vanished and then reappeared years after the war's end, a relic of both tragedy and the uncanny. Skeptics argue the tale is folklore, born from the countless disappearances that plagued wartime aviation. They point out that the Pacific swallowed thousands of aircraft, and the probability of finding them decades later, intact or otherwise, was slim. Yet believers hold fast, pointing to scattered reports in military archives that reference unidentified aircraft landing without clearance in the post-war years. One declassified memorandum, often cited by enthusiasts, describes an incident in 1953 when a vintage transport attempted to communicate using outdated radio codes. The file provides no conclusion, but for many, it fuels the legend. What makes this story endure is not proof, but resonance. The Second World War was defined by loss on an unimaginable scale. Families clung to hope long after telegrams arrived, whispering that perhaps their loved ones were not gone but trapped elsewhere. The ghostly return of a transport years later, even if only in rumour, gave shape to that hope. It offered a narrative where the missing were not abandoned to the sea, but carried by time itself, reappearing as a haunting reminder of war's unfinished business. Culturally, the story also reflects the anxieties of the early Cold War. In the 1950s, tales of UFOs, missing time, and unexplained aerial phenomena flourished. Against that backdrop, the reappearance of a lost wartime plane seemed not only possible but symbolic. It suggested that the skies still held secrets, that the new jet age had inherited mysteries from the propeller era. For historians, the tale sits uneasily between fact and folklore. No concrete evidence has surfaced. A plane, a logbook, a photograph that could definitively anchor the story in reality. And yet, its persistence in oral tradition, in magazine articles, and in aviation lore suggests it speaks to something larger than itself. It is not only a ghost story, but a meditation on memory, loss, and the strange ways in which the past can intrude upon the present. Imagining the scene captures why the legend continues to haunt. Picture ground crew in 1952 staring at a plane that should not exist, its fuselage weathered, its insignia of a war long ended. Picture them opening the cabin door to find soldiers frozen in time, their dog tags clinking faintly, their faces untouched by decay. It is a tableau of grief and wonder, a reminder that war never fully ends, It echoes, it lingers, it sometimes returns unbidden. Whether real or imagined, the story of the returning transport underscores the heart of ghost flight lore. These are not just tales of mechanical failure or navigational error, they are encounters with the impossible, moments when time and logic falter, and in those falters, we glimpse the limits of human understanding. The missing transport of World War II remains one of the most chilling of these legends. Its truth may never be proven, but its power lies not in evidence, but in the questions it raises. Can time truly fold in on itself? Can grief summon back what history has buried? Or are such stories the means by which we keep the memory of the lost alive, refusing to let them vanish entirely? As long as families remember the telegrams that ended with "missing in action," as long as the Pacific's vast silence hides its secrets, the tale of the transport that returned after the war will endure. For in that story, the dead are never wholly gone. They remain, waiting, circling in skies where time itself seems willing to break its own rules. On October the 12th, 1989, the normally quiet airport in Porto Alegre, Brazil, became the stage for one of the eeriest legends in aviation history. Air traffic controllers were alerted to an unidentified aircraft approaching without clearance. Radar showed its transponder code, but the information made no sense. It was a Lufthansa Boeing 727, a model long in service but linked to a flight number that had been missing for more than 3 decades. Controllers scrambled to respond, unsure whether they were facing a hijacking, a technical error, or something stranger. What followed has since become one of the most disturbing ghost flight stories ever told, the tale of Flight 513, which supposedly landed with its passengers reduced to skeletons. The legend claims that Flight 513 took off from Aachen, West Germany, in September 1954 bound for Porto Alegre. On board were 92 passengers and 4 crew. It was a routine transatlantic route for Lufthansa, then a revitalized airline in post-war Europe. The plane departed without issue, its weather forecast favorable, its engines freshly inspected. Yet somewhere over the Atlantic it disappeared. No distress calls were made. Radar contact was lost. Search efforts spanned thousands of miles of ocean, but no wreckage was ever found. The aircraft and everyone aboard were written off as lost. Families grieved and Lufthansa closed the file. Decades passed. Then in 1989, radar operators in Porto Alegre picked up a signal from an approaching aircraft. Controllers made contact, but the voice on the other end was garbled, faint, and seemed to repeat outdated Lufthansa call signs. Against all logic, the blip resolved into the form of a Boeing 727 descending toward the runway. Witnesses later described its approach as steady, almost mechanical, as though guided by invisible hands. The landing gear lowered, the engines throttled back, and the plane touched down with uncanny precision. It rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway, silent. When ground crews approached, expecting to be met by bewildered passengers, they found the cabin eerily still. The boarding stairs were rolled into place, but no one emerged. Authorities finally forced open the doors, and inside they encountered a sight that would haunt them for years: the remains of 92 passengers and 4 crew members, all seated upright, reduced to skeletons. Their clothing was intact, their positions frozen as if death had come sudden in mid-flight. Even more chilling, the captain's skeleton was found in the cockpit, hands still gripping the controls, as though he had guided the plane to its landing despite being long dead. The story spread rapidly through newspapers and tabloids, especially in South America and Europe. Headlines spoke of a ghost plane that had crossed the Atlantic decades late, carrying its silent cargo to its intended destination. Paranormal enthusiasts embraced it as proof of time slips, interdimensional travel, or cosmic punishment. The image of a skeleton crew landing a plane perfectly became a symbol of the unexplainable. How could a plane lost in 1954 land intact in 1989? How could skeletons pilot an aircraft? And why did the flight return precisely to the city it was meant to reach, as though fulfilling its final obligation? Skeptics dismiss the entire account as fiction. They point out that Lufthansa records list no Flight 513 disappearing in 1954. The details first appeared in sensational magazines, notorious for blending fact and fantasy. Aviation experts argue that even if such a plane had vanished, fuel would never last decades, nor would engines operate without maintenance. The logistics alone make the story impossible. Yet for many, these logical rebuttals only add to the tale's haunting power. The impossibility is what gives it its mythic quality. Legends thrive not because they are true, but because they capture the imagination. The tale of Flight 513 echoes older maritime lore, especially that of the Flying Dutchman, the ghost ship doomed to sail forever without making port. In Flight 513, the sea is replaced by sky, the endless ocean by empty airways. It is the same archetype of travellers trapped outside of time, returning only as shadows of themselves. For families who had lost loved ones in real aviation disasters, the story offered both horror and solace. Horror in the image of skeletal passengers locked in eternal flight, solace in the thought that their journey had not ended in fire or drowning, but in some suspended state finally reaching its destination. The story also speaks to a deeper cultural unease. Air travel, for all its precision, still leaves passengers vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Pilots rely on instruments, radar, and ground communication to navigate an invisible network of airways. When a plane disappears, it feels like a rupture in that carefully ordered system, as though the sky itself has betrayed its promise. Ghost flight stories like Flight 513 dramatize that rupture. They remind us that even the most advanced machines can be lost to mystery. Perhaps the most unsettling element of the Flight 513 tale is its ending. Unlike other ghost flights that supposedly reappeared briefly before vanishing again, this plane is said to have landed, delivered its passengers, albeit as skeletons, and then sat silently on the runway. That image of a tangible aircraft filled with the dead blurs the line between legend and physical reality. It is a story that insists on being more than myth, even if every rational analysis says otherwise. Whether one believes it or not, Flight 513 has become one of the central ghost flight legends, retold in books, documentaries, and online forums. Its details may shift, its credibility may waver, but the core remains chilling. An aircraft vanished only to return decades later, guided to its destination by hands that should have long since turned to dust. In the end, Flight 513 tells us less about aviation than about ourselves. It is a story of unfinished journeys, of the human need to believe that nothing is ever truly lost, even when reason insists otherwise. The passengers of that phantom Boeing may never have existed, but their legend continues to circle the skies, a ghostly reminder that some flights never really end. The Amazon basin is vast beyond comprehension, a green ocean of trees stretching across half a continent. Within its depths lie thousands of hidden places where time seems to stand still. Rivers bend like serpents, storms brew without warning, and remote villages see things the wider world dismisses as impossible. For decades, Brazil's jungle airstrips, rudimentary runways carved from forest clearings, have been at the centre of one of aviation's strangest threads of lore. Reports of ghost planes appearing, landing, or circling only to vanish without a trace. Unlike the well-documented cases of missing flights in the Atlantic, these stories are more elusive, tied to eyewitness accounts in remote outposts where the jungle swallows evidence and memories alike. Pilots flying the Amazon know its dangers intimately. The canopy stretches for hundreds of miles with no landmarks to guide by. Radio contact can fade in minutes, leaving aviators cut off from the outside world. Weather shifts suddenly, a sky of clear blue turning into walls of thunderclouds. Many aircraft, both civilian and military, have disappeared in these skies, their fates never confirmed. Some are presumed to have crashed, their wreckage consumed by vegetation within days, but others linger in rumour as phantom aircraft, seen long after they were declared lost. One such story comes from 1979, when villagers near Santarém reported hearing the steady hum of engines overhead. Looking up, they saw a twin propeller plane circling at low altitude. Its fuselage was faded, and its markings were indistinct, as though eroded by decades of weather. Witnesses claim they saw figures inside the cockpit, though the windows were clouded and dim. The plane circled twice before veering toward an abandoned airstrip deeper in the jungle. When locals followed hours later, they found no sign of it. The strip was empty, the soil undisturbed, as if nothing had landed there at all. Similar accounts emerged throughout the 1980s. Miners, missionaries, and indigenous guides told of old DT-3s and Catalinas gliding silently overhead. Many described them as unusually quiet, their engines droning like distant thunder, their presence chilling. Some even said the planes carried markings of airlines that no longer existed, logos faded into ghostly outlines. In one story, recounted by a missionary in Acre, a ghostly aircraft was seen descending toward a strip lit by kerosene lamps. The villagers who watched claimed it touched down, its wheels stirring dust, but when they approached minutes later, the airstrip lay empty. These tales were often dismissed by authorities as misidentifications of real flights. In the Amazon, small regional planes hop between jungle towns daily, many of them old and weathered. To an untrained eye, any outdated model might seem ghostly. Radar coverage is sparse, meaning unidentified flights are common, but believers insist the details go beyond ordinary explanation. The descriptions of aircraft from bygone decades, the sudden vanishings, the silence on radios, all suggest something stranger at work. The folklore of the Amazon is rich with stories of time and space behaving unpredictably. Indigenous traditions speak of places where spirits of the air dwell, guiding or confusing travellers. In some legends, entire villages vanish, swallowed by the jungle's shifting energies. Against that backdrop, the notion of ghost planes does not feel impossible. Instead, it fits into a cultural landscape where the line between the material and the mystical is fluid. There are also chilling accounts from jungle pilots themselves. In 1984, a Brazilian aviator flying cargo from Manaus to a remote logging camp reported encountering a phantom blip on his radar. Moments later, he spotted a vintage four-engine aircraft flying parallel to him. Its lights flickered weakly, its fuselage streaked with rust. He attempted radio contact but received only static. Within minutes, the plane banked sharply and disappeared into storm clouds. Later, when he described the sighting, he realized the model matched a Lockheed Constellation, a plane type retired from Brazilian service decades earlier. Another pilot told of attempting to land at a jungle strip near the Rio Negro, only to find another plane occupying the runway. As he circled to wait, the plane below shimmered strangely in the heat haze before vanishing outright. He landed minutes later, shaken but alive. When he spoke to locals, they told him others had seen the same vision over the years. A phantom aircraft that appears during dusk, always on the same strip, always disappearing before it can be approached. These stories raise unsettling questions. Could weather phenomena, mirages, reflections, or unusual light conditions explain such sightings? Could faulty instruments, radar echoes, or stressed pilots conjure illusions of planes that are not there? Perhaps, but the persistence of these tales, passed across decades and regions, suggests something more than simple error. They may not all be literal truths, but they reveal how the jungle itself seems to conspire with mystery, erasing evidence and amplifying wonder. What makes the Amazon airstrip stories unique is their intimacy. Unlike legends of oceanic vanishings or transatlantic ghost flights, these are often personal encounters, recounted by villagers, hunters, or lone pilots. They do not speak of grand tragedies, but of fleeting glimpses, of the uncanny brushing against the ordinary. A mother looking up while hanging laundry, a child pointing at a faded plane gliding overhead, a pilot sweating in a cockpit as radar ghosts flicker. These are moments that lodge in memory, whispered around campfires and in hangars alike. Even today, with satellites mapping every corner of the globe, the Amazon retains its secrets. Planes still vanish into its green expanse. Occasionally, wreckage is discovered by chance, stumbled upon by loggers or explorers decades after the crash. Yet other aircraft remain missing, their fate unknown. In these gaps, the legend of phantom jungle airstrips continues to grow. For the people who live along the rivers and under the endless canopy, the skies hold more than clouds and storms. They hold echoes, planes from another time circling patiently, searching for runways that may no longer exist. Some say they are relics of the war years, others that they are caught in loops of time. But all agree on one thing: the Amazon has the power to keep its secrets, releasing them only when it chooses. Brazil's phantom airstrips are not just about vanished planes. They are about the enduring possibility that the past still lingers above us, circling quietly, sometimes descending just close enough for us to glimpse before vanishing again. And as long as there are skies over the jungle, there will be those who swear they have heard the drone of engines no longer meant to fly. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unforgiving, became one of the greatest graveyards of aircraft during the Second World War. Thousands of bombers lifted off from island bases and aircraft carriers, their bellies heavy with fuel and explosives, only to vanish into storms or sink beneath the waves without leaving a trace. Some of these disappearances were explained: enemy fire, fuel exhaustion, sudden weather. But others left no wreckage, no oil slicks, not even a fragment of wing floating on the water. It was within this theatre of uncertainty that legends of ghost bombers were born. Planes reported years, even decades after their squadrons were declared lost. One of the most unsettling stories dates to 1945, in the war's final months. A formation of B-24 liberators departed from an island base in Micronesia on a long-range bombing run. Weather was favourable, their route well established. Hours into the flight, radio contact faltered. At first, it was dismissed as static interference, common in the Pacific, but when the formation failed to return by nightfall, the airfield launched search efforts. For days, reconnaissance planes combed the sea, but no wreckage was ever sighted. The bombers were written off, their crews memorialised, their fate unknown. Then, according to reports whispered among Navy personnel, strange sightings began to emerge. A year after the war, sailors aboard a freighter near the Marshall Islands claimed to see a formation of bombers overhead, outdated models flying low and uncoordinated. They attempted to signal, but the planes did not respond. One witness swore he could see faces at the gunner ports, pale and staring. The bombers vanished into the horizon, leaving no record on radar. Some dismissed the account as fatigue or imagination, but others insisted it was the lost squadron still patrolling skies long after their time. In the 1960s, another tale surfaced. A lone B-25 bomber was allegedly sighted near Papua New Guinea, flying low with one engine sputtering. Pilots in modern aircraft reported intercepting it briefly before it disappeared into clouds. The markings were said to match those of planes lost in 1943, though records offered no explanation for how such a machine could still be airborne 20 years later. To skeptics, it was a misidentification, a confused glimpse of an old aircraft still in civilian use. To believers, it was proof that some bombers of the Pacific were caught in loops of time, appearing and vanishing without explanation. The lore deepened when stories of phantom landings began to circulate. One account told of an American airfield in the Philippines, where, in the early 1950s, ground crews were startled by the sudden appearance of a bomber on final approach. It touched down with precision, taxied as if under control, and then, before anyone could reach it, faded into nothing. Witnesses swore they heard the roar of engines and saw the dust of the runway stirred by its wheels, yet there was no plane, no wreckage, only the echo of something that should not have been there. Such tales may seem fantastic, but they thrive because of the Pacific's brutal realities. The ocean is vast enough to erase all evidence of disaster. A bomber crashing into deep water could disappear without a ripple, its remains never to be found. Families back home received telegrams stating missing in action, but no closure followed. Against this backdrop of grief and unanswered questions, ghost stories filled the void. A plane seen decades later, even as a phantom, gave the missing a strange kind of afterlife. The psychological toll on airmen also fed these legends. Pilots returning from missions often spoke of mirages and ghostly lights, the result of exhaustion and the disorienting immensity of sea and sky. In such conditions, it was easier to imagine the shadows of vanished squadrons flying alongside them. And yet some reports came from seasoned crews, men hardened by war, who insisted what they saw was no illusion. They described formation patterns, aircraft numbers, even insignias, details too precise, they argued, to be tricks of the mind. The Pacific bombers' legends also intersected with broader myths, particularly those of the Bermuda Triangle. Though geographically distinct, both regions fostered tales of disappearances without wreckage, compasses spinning wildly, and aircraft reappearing in impossible ways. Some theorists suggested magnetic anomalies, others time distortions. A few tied the stories to UFO lore, claiming that vanished bombers had been taken, or returned, by forces beyond human understanding. Yet even stripped of supernatural layers, the ghost bomber legends hold weight as cultural memory. They symbolize the unfinished stories of war, the soldiers who left home and never returned. When a fisherman in the Marshalls claims to have seen old bombers overhead, or a pilot near New Guinea swears a World War II plane crossed his path, it is less about literal aircraft and more about echoes of loss. The war ended, but its shadows lingered in the skies. In Brazil, decades later, farmers along the Amazon also reported seeing bombers overhead, old silhouettes that vanished before reaching the horizon. Though far from the Pacific front, these sightings were woven into the same mythology. Perhaps the bombers were not only relics of war, but universal symbols of absence, reappearing wherever people still felt the weight of loss. The vanishing bombers of the Pacific remind us that history does not always rest quietly. Planes truly did disappear in staggering numbers during the war, and their stories remain incomplete. Some rest on the ocean floor undiscovered. Others perhaps survive only as legends, phantom flights that circle in memory, refusing to land. Whether seen in waking vision, radar glitch, or whispered story, they are a testament to the war's enduring mysteries. When the sun sets over the endless Pacific, it is easy to imagine their shadows still crossing the skies, the drone of engines faint in the distance, the faint glimmer of wings against the horizon. To those who lost fathers, brothers, or sons aboard those bombers, the possibility that they are still out there, even as phantoms, is not horror but remembrance. The ocean swallowed them, but the sky, it seems, has never let them go. The Andes Mountains rise like a jagged spine across South America, their peaks slicing into the sky at altitudes that test even the most powerful aircraft. For centuries, travelers whispered of the mountain's dangers, avalanches, storms, and sudden disappearances. In the age of aviation, those warnings took on new meaning. The Andes became a graveyard of planes, swallowing them into glaciers and valleys where wreckage might remain hidden for decades. Among these stories lies one of the most enduring mysteries of South American aviation. Flights that vanished into the Andes, only to be remembered in whispers as ghostly reappearances long after they were declared lost. Perhaps the most famous case is the 1972 tragedy of the Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH-227, carrying a rugby team that crashed high in the mountains en route to Chile. That story became legendary not because the plane reappeared, but because of the survivors' ordeal and the unimaginable choices they faced. Yet around the Andes, other stories emerged of aircraft not simply crashing but vanishing entirely, their absence giving rise to ghost flight legends every bit as haunting as the tales of the Atlantic or Pacific. In 1947, for example, a twin-engine transport left Buenos Aires bound for Santiago. The weather was unstable but not considered dangerous. Dozens of passengers boarded, expecting a routine flight across the mountain range. Somewhere above the Cordillera, radio contact ceased. The last transmission, garbled by static, mentioned turbulence and instrument trouble. Search teams scoured the snowy passes for weeks, but the plane was never found. Families clung to hope even years later. Then, according to local reports, shepherds in Chile claimed to have seen a silver plane glinting in the sun, circling low above a valley. It looked worn as though aired, yet bore markings of a 1940s airline. By the time villagers reached the valley floor, nothing was there. The Andes seem to encourage such legends. Its terrain is so vast and treacherous that disappearances feel more like vanishments into another realm than accidents. Pilots speak of sudden winds that strike like invisible fists, hurling planes into rock walls. Locals tell of mountain corridors where compasses spin uselessly, as if the earth itself confuses navigation. Against this backdrop, ghost flight stories thrive. When planes vanish here, people are willing to believe they might not be gone at all, but caught in some hidden fold of the mountains, destined to reappear at strange moments. In the 1950s, a particularly chilling tale spread through Santiago. Air traffic controllers claimed to have received a brief static-filled signal from a flight declared lost years earlier. The call sign matched an aircraft that had disappeared in 1939 on a route from Lima to Buenos Aires. The voice on the transmission was faint but insistent, descending through cloud cover, preparing to land. Controllers attempted to respond, but the signal faded. Radar showed nothing. To those who heard the account, it seemed as if the lost flight had tried to complete its journey decades later, reaching out from whatever limbo had claimed it. The legends grew stronger as technology advanced. By the 1970s, radar systems covered much of the Andes, yet phantom blips still appeared. Controllers in La Paz and Santiago told of ghost echoes, planes that appeared suddenly on screens, moved with the speed of commercial aircraft, then vanished. Pilots reported seeing distant lights weaving among the peaks, only to fade when approached. Some insisted these were real aircraft, old models flying where no flight plans were filed, their engines droning with a mechanical rhythm long out of date. Skeptics dismissed these stories as folklore fueled by grief. The Andes are littered with undiscovered wrecks. Glaciers move slowly, swallowing up planes and releasing them decades later. In fact, modern climbers have occasionally stumbled upon fuselages frozen into the ice, perfectly preserved until the thaw revealed them. When such discoveries occur, they remind us that many ghost flights may have been real planes lying hidden, their sudden reappearance simply nature giving up its secrets. And yet, the folkloric element cannot be ignored. Villagers tell of aircraft landing on makeshift strips, passengers looking bewildered, only for both plane and people to vanish when approached. Hunters whisper of hearing engines at night, too close and too clear to be imaginary, yet finding no aircraft come morning. These stories weave themselves into the cultural fabric of the Andes, a region where mystery and survival have always been entwined. The Andes air mystery is not about one single vanished flight, but about the way disappearances accumulate in a place that seems designed to hide them. Every ridge and valley becomes a potential tomb. Every storm hides its secrets well. When a lost plane reappears on radar or in rumour decades later, it speaks to the human need for closure in a land that rarely offers it. For families who lost loved ones, ghost flight tales offer a paradoxical comfort. The thought that a vanished plane might still be flying somewhere, caught in a pocket of time, is less unbearable than imagining it shattered against rock. To believe in the Andes ghost flights is to believe the mountains do not only take, but sometimes return what they have hidden. Today, with satellite imaging and GPS, many assume such mysteries are relics of the past. Yet even now, planes disappear over the Andes. Not all are found. The mountains remain vast, and storms still come without warning. Each new disappearance renews the old stories. Each missing aircraft becomes a candidate for future legends of ghost flights. The Andes air mystery endures because it stands at the intersection of geography and imagination. It is a place where planes vanish as easily as footsteps in snow, where time itself feels unstable among the peaks. Whether the stories of phantom sightings are tricks of the eye, echoes of grief, or something stranger, they remind us that the sky is not always a safe passage. In the Andes, flights may depart, but no one can ever be sure they will arrive, or if they do, what year it might be when they land. The Pacific War was fought not only on islands and seas, but in the vast skies that connected them. For the Japanese Empire, aviation became both a symbol of power and a source of devastating loss. Thousands of aircraft, fighters, bombers, and transports were dispatched across the Pacific theatre. Many never returned. They were lost to anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, or sudden storms that rolled over the ocean like walls of iron. But out of these countless vanishings grew a strange folklore among soldiers, sailors, and island villagers. Stories of Japanese planes that continued to appear years after they were destroyed, ghostly machines haunting the skies as if the war had never ended. These came to be known in whispers as the sky ghosts of the Pacific. The earliest accounts came during the war itself. American and Australian patrols stationed on the remote islands reported seeing formations of planes that never appeared on radar, their engines droning faintly in the distance. At first, such stories were dismissed as nerves or fatigue. The Pacific was a brutal environment, and long hours under the sun frayed the senses, yet the descriptions were too consistent to ignore. Witnesses spoke of faded silhouettes of Zero fighters gliding silently overhead, their markings visible but their movements unnatural, steady, almost mechanical, as though guided by some unseen will. Attempts to intercept them failed. Pilots sent aloft to investigate found only empty skies. After the war ended, such stories did not fade. In fact, they grew stronger. Islanders across Micronesia, the Solomons, and the Marshalls told of planes appearing during the quiet hours of dawn or dusk. Some described hearing engines long before seeing anything in the sky. Others swore they saw full squadrons, outdated models circling slowly, flying in tight formation. When approached, the planes vanished into subster clouds. A fisherman in Palau once claimed a fighter swooped low over his boat, his pilot's face pale and rigid, before disappearing as suddenly as it had come. He was so shaken that he refused to fish in that region again. One of the most persistent legends comes from the Philippines. In the late 1950s, villagers near Clark Air Base reported a recurring sound of aircraft late at night. Looking up, they saw bombers passing overhead, Mitsubishi G4Ms, nicknamed Betties by the Allies. Yet these were planes long retired, their wings riddled with the holes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Some claim they could even see sparks trailing from the engines. When Air Force personnel investigated, no flights were scheduled at those times. The radar showed nothing. But the reports continued for years, each describing the same ghostly procession of wartime bombers. The Japanese themselves carried their own folklore into the post-war years. In Japan, ex-pilots spoke in hushed tones of hikare, flying spirits. According to their accounts, downed comrades sometimes returned to escort living pilots through dangerous skies. Tales circulated of Zero fighters appearing out of nowhere during training flights in the 1950s, flying wingtip to wingtip before vanishing into sunlight. To some, these were protective spirits, ensuring safe passage. To others, they were restless ghosts, unable to accept the war's end. Families of the fallen even reported dreams of hearing engines outside their homes, believing it was the spirits of their sons flying past one last time. Western observers, intrigued by these accounts, tried to explain them scientifically. Could the Pacific's unique weather create mirages in the sky? Could atmospheric conditions bend light in such a way that aircraft from far away appeared close by? Perhaps radar echoes, distorted by storms, created illusions of phantom squadrons. Yet these explanations could not account for the sheer consistency of the sightings, often involving multiple witnesses describing the same details at the same time. The persistence of the legends suggests that they cannot be dismissed as simple errors. Psychology also plays a role. For island communities scarred by the war, the sky remained a theatre of trauma. Planes meant destruction, but they also symbolised an era that had reshaped lives forever. To see a ghost plane was to relive those moments, to feel the war had never truly ended. For veterans, especially, the idea of comrades still flying their final missions became a powerful metaphor for grief and a memory. Ghost flights allowed the dead to remain present, circling above, forever part of the living sky. Cultural memory gave these stories longevity. In Micronesian folklore, spirits often travel across the air or sea, lingering in the places where they died. The idea of sky ghosts fits neatly into this worldview. Villagers believed the souls of downed pilots remained bound to their machines, condemned to repeat their final missions. Each appearance was not just a haunting, but a reminder of unfinished business, lives cut short, battles unresolved. By the late 20th century, the legends of Japanese ghost planes had become part of aviation lore worldwide. Books on the paranormal devoted entire chapters to the phantom squadrons of the Pacific. Television specials dramatized fishermen's accounts of spectral fighters and bombers. Even pilots of modern commercial flights over the Pacific sometimes joked about watching for Zeros at sunset, a dark humour born from the persistence of the tales. What makes the Japanese sky ghosts distinct from other ghost flight legends is their collective nature. While most ghost flight stories focus on a single vanished plane reappearing decades later, the Pacific tales often describe whole squadrons moving in unison, disciplined even in death. They are not lost individuals, but echoes of war itself preserved in formation. This imagery captures the scale of the Pacific conflict, where thousands of aircraft fought and fell together, leaving the skies heavy with memory. Today, when the sun dips over the Pacific and the horizon glows blood red, it is easy to imagine why such stories endure. The ocean is vast, the islands isolated, and the echoes of war still linger in the bones of wrecks rusting on the beaches and jungles. Above it all, in the minds of those who remember, the sound of distant engines may still be heard, carried on the wind. The Japanese sky ghosts remind us that war does not end simply because treaties are signed. Its shadows linger, circling silently, reminding us of the cost paid by those who never returned home. The Pacific skies hold their secrets well, and perhaps that is why the legends remain so vivid. They are not simply about planes that vanish and reappear, they are about memory itself, about the dead refusing to be forgotten, about battles still echoing in the clouds. And as long as the Pacific stretches endless and blue, there will be those who swear they have seen them. Ghostly squadrons, flying in formation, bound forever to the war that took them. The Second World War ended with the skies still haunted by disappearances, but in its aftermath the world entered another era where aviation would become both weapon and mystery, the Cold War. From the late 1940s to the 1980s, the superpowers stretched their reach across the globe, and with them came new legends of ghost flights. Unlike the war years, these were not stories of overloaded transports or bombers vanishing in combat. These were tales of aircraft slipping from time itself, planes that appeared on radar decades late, pilots who reported skies that did not match their maps, and stories whispered in Moscow, Washington, and Berlin of machines crossing not just borders but eras. The Cold War was a time of secrecy. Vast networks of surveillance flights patrolled the skies, often skimming dangerously close to enemy territory. Both NATO and the Soviet Union relied heavily on reconnaissance aircraft, RB-47 Stratojets, U-2s, and two 95 Bears to monitor each other. These flights were deliberately kept off public records, their paths known only to select officials. When such planes went missing, governments often said nothing, leaving families to mourn quietly. Out of that silence grew legends. Without wreckage or explanation, the idea of Cold War flights slipping into other times and places became a way to explain the unexplainable. One of the earliest accounts emerged in 1952, when radar stations in Greenland tracked a large formation of aircraft flying in from the east. At first, they assumed it was a Soviet probe testing defences, yet when interceptors scrambled, nothing was there. The radar blips vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. Operators swore they had seen propeller-driven bombers, an oddity since by the 1950s jets were already the norm. When debriefed, they described the silhouettes as resembling World War II era B-17s. How could a squadron of bombers from the 1940s appear in 1952, flying at altitude, only to disappear without trace? The Soviets had their own tales. In the archives of the Cold War, whispers exist of a 1960 incident near Murmansk. A Soviet air defense station reported an unidentified aircraft entering their airspace. The fighter jets scrambled to intercept described the plane as an American C-54 transport, an aircraft type common in the 1940s but obsolete by then. Pilots claimed they could see the faded US markings on its fuselage and even its crew staring back in confusion. When ordered to fire, the Soviet jets closed in, but the transport vanished into the cloud and never reappeared. In the official report, the incident was dismissed as a radar ghost. Among the pilots, however, it was remembered as a time-slip flight, a relic of another decade intruding upon their skies. Western Europe also bred such stories. During the 1970s, in divided Berlin, air traffic controllers sometimes reported unexplained echoes appearing over the restricted corridors that linked West Berlin to the outside world. Commercial crews flying the air bridges spoke of spotting outdated Soviet Lisunov-Li, two transports gliding below them, their engines strangely muffled, their lights dim. They would vanish within minutes. In one chilling account, a British pilot swore that one of these phantom planes was so close he could read the Cyrillic markings on its tail, though no such aircraft existed in active service at the time. Cold War ghost flights were not always sightings of the past intruding on the present. Some accounts describe the opposite, flights that disappeared into silence, only to return decades later. In 1978, a rumour spread in Eastern Europe of a Polish military transport that landed in Hungary bearing flight logs and papers dated 1955. Its crew, visibly shaken, insisted it had been only a 2-hour flight from Warsaw. Officials immediately confiscated the aircraft and silenced the story. Whether fabrication or truth, it fed into the growing belief that the Cold War skies contained corridors of time that swallowed and returned aircraft without warning. Part of what gave these stories longevity was the atmosphere of secrecy that defined the era. Governments on both sides were unwilling to admit mistakes. If a plane went missing, officials often denied it ever existed. This made the appearance of unexplained aircraft all the more unnerving. In a world where surveillance was constant and information tightly controlled, the sudden intrusion of ghost flights was not just a mystery, it was a breach of the iron walls of knowledge the Cold War had built. Psychologists argue that many of these tales can be explained by the paranoia of the era. Radar was still prone to glitches, especially in harsh Arctic or mountainous environments. Pilots under immense stress might misidentify old aircraft types or hallucinate under fatigue. Yet even these explanations cannot account for the consistency of the reports across continents, from Greenland to Berlin to the Russian Arctic. The Cold War was a global chessboard, and ghost flights seemed to appear in every corner of it. Folklore scholars point out that these stories mirror older maritime legends. Just as sailors once told of phantom galleons appearing on horizons long after their time, airmen of the Cold War filled the skies with echoes of lost squadrons. The difference is that in this era, the stakes were nuclear. A phantom plane on radar could spark panic, even war. That is why so many of these incidents remain buried in archives, mentioned only in a passing by the veterans who later recalled them in hushed tones. Today, with the Cold War long over, the ghost flight stories of that era remain part of its shadowy mythology. They remind us that secrecy breeds mystery, and where official silence falls, folklore rushes in. Were these flights truly relics of the past? Time slips that dragged aircraft decades forward? Or were they products of nervous men staring too long into screens, hearing too much static in their radios? Whatever the truth, the Cold War sky was not just filled with jets and bombers, it was filled with uncertainty, with the possibility that the very air was unstable, that history itself could intrude upon the present. And as long as pilots and controllers continue to whisper of the strange aircraft they saw, the legend of Cold War flight slips will remain aloft, forever circling in the uneasy skies of memory. Few tales of the 20th century blur the line between science, myth and conspiracy, quite like the Philadelphia experiment. Officially, it was said to be a naval test in 1943, when the US destroyer escort USS Eldridge was allegedly rendered invisible, or even teleported, from Philadelphia to Norfolk before reappearing again. The Navy has long denied such an experiment ever took place, but the legend gained a life of its own, fueled by whispers of cloaking technology, time travel and horrifying consequences for the crew. What began as a maritime myth soon spread its influence into the skies, feeding directly into stories of ghost flights and planes slipping between moments in time. The tale first surfaced publicly in 1955, when a man named Carl Allen, writing under the alias Carlos Allende, sent letters to a researcher describing the supposed experiment. According to his account, the Navy had attempted to use electromagnetic fields to bend light around the ship, making it invisible to enemy radar. But the results went far beyond invisibility. Witnesses allegedly saw the Eldridge vanish from its dock in Philadelphia and reappear minutes later in Norfolk, over 200 miles away, before returning again. More chilling were the claims about the crew. Some were said to have been fused into the ship's steel, others driven mad, and a few simply disappeared. Though dismissed by scientists as fabrication, the Philadelphia experiment captured public imagination. In the Cold War climate, where governments were known to hide experimental technologies, the story seemed plausible enough to endure, and its echoes soon carried into the world of aviation. If ships could slip through space and time, why not planes? By the 1960s, pilots began reporting incidents that conspiracy theorists tied directly to the Philadelphia legend. Airmen spoke of sudden whiteouts in the sky, where compasses spun wildly and radios filled with static. Some reported losing minutes. What felt like an instant to them turned out to be half an hour on the clocks below. These time distortions mirrored the claims made about the Eldridge, and believers argued they were signs of the same technology at work. One famous example involved a military transport flying near Bermuda in 1963. According to crew testimony, the aircraft entered a dense cloud where all instruments failed. When it emerged, the sun's position was wrong, and base control reported they were 30 minutes behind schedule, though the crew insisted only moments had passed. Such accounts soon became linked to ghost flight stories, suggesting that vanished planes had not crashed, but been caught in similar field experiments, only to reappear years or decades later. The Philadelphia experiment also provided a convenient framework for legends like Pan Am Flight 914 or Brazil's Flight 513. Instead of dismissing them as folklore, believers wove them into a narrative of secret research into electromagnetic cloaking and time manipulation. If ships could vanish in 1943, why not airliners in the decades that followed? Each ghost flight became, in the eyes of conspiracy theorists, a continuation of that experiment in Philadelphia. The story gained further traction in the 1980s when a Hollywood film titled The Philadelphia Experiment dramatized the tale, depicting sailors hurled through time. Around the same period, declassified documents revealed the existence of real military research projects involving radar invisibility and electromagnetic fields. Though far less dramatic than teleportation, these programs gave the legend a veneer of plausibility. For those inclined to believe, the ghost flights of the post-war years were no longer mysteries of weather or human error. They were casualties of experiments meddling with forces beyond human control. Skeptics, of course, argue differently. They point out that Allende's letters were riddled with inconsistencies and that no credible witnesses ever confirmed the experiment. Historians note that the Eldridge was not even in Philadelphia during the dates in question. As for ghost flights, aviation experts attribute them to navigational mistakes, poor weather, or simple myth-making. But the Philadelphia experiment persists precisely because it offers an explanation that is at once technological and supernatural. It suggests that the extraordinary vanishing of aircraft might not be accidents at all, but evidence of hidden science. The connection between the Philadelphia experiment and airborne legends reveals something deeper about human imagination. At its core, the tale is about losing trust in the solidity of the world. Ships are not supposed to vanish. Planes are not supposed to slip decades into the future. Yet when they do, or when stories say they do, we reach for explanations that match the enormity of the mystery. A secret government experiment gone awry offers both blame and awe. Even today, pilots over the Atlantic or Pacific occasionally report strange anomalies. Brief lapses in time, sudden disorientation, instruments going haywire. Most are explained by natural phenomena, but a few remain unsettled. To believers, these are not coincidences. They are ripples of the same experiment that began in 1943, ripples that sometimes snatch entire planes from their era and deposit them years later. The Philadelphia experiment stands as one of the 20th century's most enduring conspiracy legends, not because it was ever proven, but because it gave voice to our deepest unease about technology and time. It became the seedbed from which ghost flight stories grew, wrapping real disappearances in the cloak of hidden science. For some, this makes the skies even more unsettling. If a ship can vanish in a naval yard and reappear miles away, who can say where a passenger plane might end up once it lifts off? Whether myth or truth, the legend ties sea and sky together in a shared narrative of disappearance. And as long as planes continue to vanish without explanation, the shadow of the Philadelphia experiment will linger, an anchor for the imagination, suggesting that somewhere, hidden behind classified files and electromagnetic fields, lies the key to every ghost flight that has ever returned decades late. When the first tales of ghost flight surfaced, skeptics quickly sought rational explanations: engine failures, storms, navigational errors. Yet as the legends grew, planes vanishing without wreckage, aircraft reappearing decades later as if no time had passed, such explanations fell short. To account for the uncanny, researchers and storytellers turned to the frontier of science itself. They began to explore the possibility that these ghost flights were not accidents at all, but evidence of time behaving in ways we scarcely understand. Thus were born the time distortion theories, attempts to explain how a plane could lift off in one era and land in another, its passengers untouched by the years in between. At the heart of these theories lies a profound question: is time as rigid as we assume, or is it flexible, prone to folds and currents like the sea? Physicists of the 20th century revealed startling possibilities. Einstein's theory of relativity showed that time is not universal but relative, slowed by gravity, stretched by speed. Astronauts circling Earth at high velocity age, fractionally less than those on the ground. Though imperceptible in daily life, these differences are real, measured in atomic clocks. To some, ghost flights became extreme examples of relativity in action. Planes caught in regions where time flowed differently, allowing hours for passengers but decades for the world below. Others pointed to natural phenomena as potential culprits. The Bermuda Triangle, with its magnetic anomalies and unpredictable storms, became central to such speculation. Some argued that unusual energy fields in the region could disrupt not only instruments but time itself, creating windows into other eras. Pilots who flew into such zones, the theory goes, might emerge years later, their aircraft preserved in the bubble of slowed time. Tales of Flight 19, Pan Am 914 and Brazil's Flight 513 all fit neatly into this idea of temporal corridors scattered across the globe. More radical theories draw on the concept of wormholes, tunnels through space-time predicted by general relativity. Though unproven, wormholes offer a framework for sudden displacements in both space and time. If such a phenomenon existed in the atmosphere, a plane could conceivably enter one and reappear decades later. This would explain why ghost flights often seem to re-emerge at their intended destinations, as though guided by the momentum of their original course. Critics counter that wormholes, if real, would likely exist only at cosmic scales, not hovering above airports or oceans. But within folklore, the image of a plane swallowed by an unseen tunnel remains compelling. Quantum physics provides another layer of speculation. Some theorists speak of many worlds, alternate timelines branching infinitely with every choice and event. A plane vanishing into the clouds by this view might slip into a parallel world where it continues its flight, only to recross into our reality decades later. This would account for the passengers' confusion. To them, no time has passed, yet they emerge into a world utterly changed. ghost flights thus become not tragedies, but visitors from neighbouring timelines, their appearance accidental breaches between realities. Skeptics dismiss these theories as science fiction dressed in scientific language. They argue that no empirical evidence supports time distortions or wormholes at the scale required to affect airplanes. They point out that most ghost flight tales lack verifiable documentation, originating instead in tabloids or folklore. To them, the stories reveal more about human imagination than physics. When a loved one vanishes without trace, it is less painful to believe they are trapped in time than to accept they were lost at sea. Time distortion theories, in this sense, are less about science and more about grief transformed into myth. Yet even skeptics acknowledge that our understanding of time is incomplete. Modern physics continues to wrestle with paradoxes, particles that seem to communicate instantaneously across distance, black holes that warp time into near standstill, cosmic radiation hinting at dimensions beyond our senses. Against this backdrop, ghost flight legends serve as reminders of how fragile our grasp of time may be. Perhaps the stories are not literal truths, but intuitive echoes of real mysteries science has yet to explain. What makes time distortion theories especially enduring is their symmetry with the human experience. We all live aware of time's passage, yet secretly wish it could bend. The idea that an aircraft could take off in 1955 and land in 1985, its passengers untouched, speaks to our deepest hopes and fears. It is both horror and fantasy, horror in the loss of decades, fantasy in the preservation of youth. For families who lost relatives to vanished flights, the theories offer bittersweet solace. Maybe they are not gone, only misplaced in another chapter of time. In popular culture, these ideas thrive. Films, television shows, and novels frequently imagine planes caught in time slips, landing in futures their passengers cannot comprehend. Science fiction borrows heavily from the Philadelphia experiment myth, from Bermuda Triangle tales, and from the whispered testimonies of air traffic controllers who swore they saw outdated planes appear on their screens. Each retelling reinforces the link between ghost flights and time distortion, ensuring that even skeptics know the outlines of the legend. Ultimately, time distortion theories are less about solving mysteries than about keeping them alive. They acknowledge that while aviation has mapped the skies with precision, the sky itself still contains the unknown. Whether through relativity, wormholes, or alternate timelines, ghost flights become symbols of time's instability. They remind us that technology cannot master everything, that even the most advanced planes can vanish into a silence that no searchlight can penetrate. And so the theories endure. Half science, half superstition, wholly human. They keep alive the image of ghost flights circling somewhere above us, suspended between eras, waiting for a moment when time will release them once more. Whether one believes them or not, the legends continue to haunt the skies, carried on the steady drone of engines that may belong not to the present, but to some forgotten hour, still echoing across the heavens. Few regions of the world carry such a weight of mystery as the Bermuda Triangle. This vast stretch of ocean, roughly bounded by Miami, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda, has become synonymous with vanishing ships and planes. While sailors told strange tales of it for centuries, the legend took on new life in the 20th century, when modern aircraft began to disappear within its borders without explanation. It is here, perhaps more than anywhere else on Earth, that ghost flight stories find their natural home. To understand the mythology of planes reappearing decades later, one must first pass through the fog of the Bermuda Triangle. The Triangle's reputation began in earnest after World War II. Disappearances of aircraft and naval vessels in the region were documented long before, but the December 1945 loss of Flight 19 cemented its fame. 5 US Navy bombers vanished during a training exercise, followed by a rescue plane that also disappeared. Not a single trace of wreckage was ever recovered. Newspapers seized on the story, presenting it not just as a tragedy but as a mystery. The idea that an entire squadron of modern aircraft could vanish in broad daylight with radio contact only half lost seemed unbelievable. From that moment on, the Bermuda Triangle became a stature for the uncanny. As aviation expanded in the post-war years, more tales emerged. Commercial planes reported compasses spinning wildly when entering the region. Pilots described sudden banks of fog that seemed to swallow their instruments. Some claimed they lost hours of time, emerging to find their clocks mismatched with ground control. Others reported seeing planes from another era, old DC-3s and military bombers, flying in formation before vanishing into the haze. To believers, these were not hallucinations, but evidence of a hidden force within the triangle, a force that could bend time itself. The legend gained momentum in the 1960s and 70s thanks to best-selling books and sensational articles. Writers described the Bermuda Triangle as a vortex of strange energies, perhaps a gateway to another dimension. Some suggested the presence of time warps, invisible corridors that could transport aircraft decades forward or backward. These theories meshed perfectly with ghost flight stories like Pan Am Flight 914 or Brazil's Flight 513. If planes could vanish into the triangle's mists, why could they not reappear years later on distant runways? One particularly eerie tale involves a DC-3 that vanished in the triangle in 1948, carrying 32 passengers. Search crews found nothing, yet decades later, witnesses at Miami International Airport swore they saw a ghostly plane approach the runway, its fuselage bearing markings of a long-defunct airline, its engines sputtering as if ancient. The story ends, as so many ghost flight tales do, with the aircraft fading back into the clouds. Whether fabricated or exaggerated, it reinforced the triangle's reputation as a place where vanished flights linger. Scientists, of course, have offered explanations. The region is prone to violent weather shifts, sudden squalls and waterspouts. Magnetic anomalies could affect compasses, while methane hydrates released from the ocean floor might destabilize aircraft and ships. Powerful ocean currents could easily disperse wreckage, leaving no trace. Yet none of these explanations account for the sheer persistence of the stories. To many, the Bermuda's Triangle is not merely a dangerous region. It is a place where reality itself seems thinner, where the boundaries of time and space are fragile. The cultural power of the triangle lies in its geography. It is vast enough to feel unknowable, yet close enough to major air routes that millions of passengers cross it every year. Its mix of tropical calm and sudden violence creates the perfect setting for tales of the uncanny. Unlike the Pacific or the Andes, where disappearances can be attributed to remoteness, the Bermuda Triangle is paradoxically both accessible and mysterious. It is the liminal space between safety and danger, between civilization and the unknown. For ghost flight legends, the Bermuda Triangle serves as the archetypal explanation. A plane that vanishes and reappears decades later is often said to have passed through its mists. The triangle becomes a cosmic waiting room, a place where time slows or loops, releasing aircraft long after the world has forgotten them. In this way, it is less a location than a symbol, the point on the map where human certainty dissolves, where we admit we do not control the skies as fully as we think. Even today, with satellites scanning every inch of the Earth, the Bermuda Triangle continues to inspire fear and fascination. Pilots crossing it still share nervous jokes, and tourists hear its stories retold in hotels and bars. Its legend is not weakened by rational explanations. Rather, it thrives alongside them, fueled by the human need to find meaning in loss. Every vanished flight without wreckage feeds the triangle's myth. Every ghostly reappearance, real or imagined, extends its shadow over the skies. The Bermuda Triangle remains the epicenter of ghost flight folklore. It is the imagined gateway through which planes disappear into silence and from which they return, decades late, with passengers staring blankly through windows. Whether or not it hides real dangers beyond storms and magnetism, its power as a symbol is undeniable. The triangle is the place where science ends and mystery begins, a reminder that for all our charts and instruments, the sky and sea still hold secrets that no radar can resolve. And so, in the heart of every ghost flight story, the Bermuda Triangle lingers like a silent co-pilot. Its dark waters and shifting skies waiting to swallow the next aircraft that dares to cross its invisible boundaries. From the first compass needle balanced on a pin, humanity has trusted the invisible pull of Earth's magnetism to guide its journeys. For centuries, ships and explorers relied on this unseen force to cross oceans and the continents. But magnetism is not constant. Across the globe, there are regions where the magnetic field twists, dips, or weakens, places where compasses spin aimlessly and instruments falter. In the age of aviation, these anomalies took on new meaning. When an aircraft vanishes without trace, as so many ghost flight stories recount, magnetic disruption often becomes the prime suspect. Could the failures of navigation, driven by Earth's restless magnetic field, explain why so many flights disappeared, or why some seem to reappear decades later? The Bermuda Triangle is the most infamous example. Pilots flying through it have long reported compasses behaving strangely. Instead of pointing toward magnetic north, needles swing wildly, sometimes locking in the wrong direction altogether. Flight 19, the squadron of Navy Avengers that vanished in 1945, recorded such confusion in their final transmissions. Their leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, reported both compasses failing, leaving him unable to determine west from east. To some, this is the simplest explanation for their fate. Disoriented, they flew out over open ocean until fuel ran out. But for believers in ghost flights, the spinning needles mark something deeper, not just navigational error, but the presence of forces that bend time and space. Magnetic anomalies are not confined to the Atlantic. In Siberia, near the Tunguska region, explorers have recorded compasses veering erratically for decades. Pilots in the Arctic speak of the pole problem, where proximity to magnetic north causes instruments to misalign. Over the Andes, aviators tell of skies where navigation equipment goes silent, leaving only intuition to guide them. These regions often overlap with areas notorious for disappearances. The possibility that magnetism itself plays a role in vanishing aircraft is difficult to ignore. Scientists explain these anomalies in practical terms. The Earth's magnetic field is generated by molten iron moving deep within its core. This field is not uniform. It varies by location and shifts constantly. In some regions, mineral deposits near the surface can distort local readings, pulling compasses off course. In others, the angle of magnetic north relative to true north creates natural confusion. To the unprepared pilot, even a few degrees of error can mean the difference between safety and disaster. A wrong turn over jungle or ocean can leave no survivors and no wreckage, swallowed quickly by nature. Yet while science accounts for how planes might go missing, it cannot fully explain the legends of their return. How could a navigation failure result in a plane reappearing decades later, engines running, passengers seemingly untouched by time? Here, folklore stretches the explanation further. Some believe magnetic anomalies may be more than geological quirks. Instead, they might act as portals, zones where Earth's magnetic field interacts with atmospheric energy to distort time. In this view, a plane caught in such a field might slip into a hidden corridor, emerging years later as though only minutes had passed inside. The persistence of these ideas reveals more than scientific ignorance. It shows how magnetism's invisibility makes it ripe for mystery. Unlike storms or mountains, magnetic fields cannot be seen. A pilot experiencing spinning instruments feels a loss of control without a visible cause, a terror that breeds stories of the supernatural. To ground crews who watch radar echoes vanish, or to families who receive no wreckage or remains, the idea that magnetism hides deeper secrets becomes irresistible. Even skeptics admit that magnetic anomalies contribute heavily to aviation's strangest stories. During the Cold War, when reconnaissance planes flew long, secretive routes, reports of compass failure were common. In some cases, entire squadrons became disoriented, wandering off course until they vanished from radar. Though officials blamed equipment malfunctions or weather, pilots themselves often insisted that the skies seemed wrong, that their instruments were not merely broken but manipulated by unseen forces. Folklore scholars note how magnetism connects modern aviation to older maritime legends. Sailors once feared magnetic islands that drew ships off course or pulled iron nails from their hulls. The Flying Dutchman itself, the most famous ghost ship, was sometimes said to be cursed by the pull of strange forces in southern seas. Ghost flights, with their erratic compasses and vanishing crews, are a natural heir to these tales. The technology changed, but the fear remained the same, that the tools we rely on to know where we are may betray us at the very moment we need them most. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these stories is the human element. Imagine sitting in a cockpit, watching your compass spin in circles, your radio hissing with static, the familiar logic of navigation slipping away. The world outside looks unchanged, blue sky, white clouds, but inside the instruments meant to anchor you to reality fail. It is in these moments that pilots describe a chilling sensation, as though they are suspended not just in space but in time, drifting beyond the normal flow of hours and minutes. Some return to tell the tale, others vanish, becoming part of the long list of flights that never arrived. Whether one views magnetic anomalies as quirks of geology or gateways to something stranger, their role in ghost flight lore is undeniable. They provide both a scientific foundation for why planes disappear and a mystical framework for why they might return. They are the invisible fault lines of the sky, places where direction, time, and trust unravel. And so, when we hear stories of aircraft landing decades late, or of planes vanishing without a trace, magnetism lingers in the background like a silent suspect. It may not explain everything, but it explains enough to keep the mystery alive. The skies, after all, are not empty. They are charged with forces we barely understand, and in those unseen currents, ghost flights may find both their doom and their passage back into our world. For every story of a ghost flight told in newspapers or whispered among families, there are quieter testimonies that emerge from the very edges of the runway. Air traffic controllers, stationed in towers across the world, have long been the unseen guardians of aviation. Their duty is to guide flights safely from takeoff to landing, to watch radar screens for anomalies, and to keep skies orderly. Yet among these professionals exist accounts that defy logic, moments when their instruments showed planes that should not have been there, when their eyes caught glimpses of aircraft long outdated, and when they spoke to pilots who identified themselves from decades past. These are the stories seldom shared officially, yet they form the backbone of ghost flight lore. One of the earliest such accounts surfaced in 1953 at a small airport in Venezuela. Controllers on duty reported a sudden radar blip from an incoming aircraft. Its transponder signaled a DC-3, a model already in decline by then. As the plane approached, they attempted to establish communication. A voice crackled through, identifying itself as a Havana flight bound for Miami, with the date given as 1948. The startled controllers tried to question the pilot, but the signal faded. Witnesses claimed the plane appeared in sight, low and slow, before banking sharply and disappearing into a bank of clouds. When radar recalibrated, it was gone. In the United States, a similar tale emerged in the 1970s from O'Hare International in Chicago. A controller working a midnight shift swore he watched an unregistered aircraft approach on his scope, its signature matching that of a 4-engine propeller-driven airliner long out of service. When he tried to contact the crew, the reply was muffled, almost like an old radio broadcast. The pilot insisted they were on approach from Buffalo, scheduled to land in 1956. Before ground crew could prepare the runway, the signal vanished. The controller's report was quietly filed away, never mentioned in public records. Europe too has its stories. In 1982, Heathrow controllers recorded what seemed to be a phantom landing. Multiple staff reported seeing the lights of an incoming aircraft on approach. Instruments tracked its descent, and runway personnel confirmed a visual. Yet when the plane touched down, there was nothing there. No physical aircraft, no passengers, no record of arrival. One veteran of the tower later described it as watching history replay itself, as though an old landing had somehow bled through into the present. These incidents are not isolated. Across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, controllers have reported anomalies that resist easy explanation. Some speak of ghostly voices over radio frequencies long abandoned, pilots calling in using defunct airline call signs. Others describe aircraft appearing on radar with outdated squawk codes, identifying themselves as flights lost decades before. While skeptics point to technical glitches, the controllers themselves often insist that what they saw or heard could not be dismissed as mere error. What makes these testimonies especially powerful is the credibility of their sources. Air traffic controllers are trained to rely on precision. Their careers depend on clear judgment, quick decision-making, and adherence to procedure. They are not prone to fanciful thinking, nor do they benefit from fabricating stories. When such individuals recount encounters with phantom aircraft, their words carry a weight beyond rumour. Psychologists suggest that the stressful nature of tower work, long hours, constant vigilance, and the burden of responsibility may contribute to heightened susceptibility to illusions. Fatigue could make radar echoes seem more significant than they are. Temperature inversions, for example, can bend radio signals, creating ghost blips on radar. Yet these explanations, while scientifically sound, rarely satisfy those who experienced the events firsthand. Controllers who swear they saw an aircraft taxiing on an empty runway, or who converse with pilots identifying themselves from lost decades, do not easily accept the idea that exhaustion alone was to blame. In many cases, eyewitness accounts from control towers align with broader ghost flight legends. The tale of Pan Am Flight 914, said to have vanished in 1955 only to reappear in Caracas decades later, is tied directly to the testimony of Venezuelan controllers. Brazil's Flight 513, the so-called skeleton flight, was reportedly logged first by startled tower staff in Porto Alegre. Even the infamous Bermuda Triangle owes much of its mystique to the final transmissions received by Florida controllers who heard Flight 19's confusion as their instruments spun out of control. Such testimonies also highlight a haunting paradox. Control towers exist to bring order to the chaos of flight. They are the link between Earth and sky, grounding aviation in procedure and technology. Yet it is from these very towers, bastions of reason and oversight, that some of the strangest ghost flight stories emerge. If even the professionals charged with guiding the skies cannot explain what they see, how can ordinary passengers or bystanders hope to? Culturally, these accounts resonate because they blur the line between technology and the supernatural. Radar, radios and transponders are supposed to anchor aviation in certainty. But when these instruments themselves report impossible things, outdated call signs, vanished blips or phantom landings, they become part of the mystery rather than its solution. In this way, ghost flights are not simply folklore passed through rumour, but phenomena recorded at the very heart of aviation's infrastructure. Today, modern technology has reduced some of the ambiguity. GPS, satellite tracking, and digital records make it harder for entire aircraft to vanish without trace. Yet anomalies still occur. Pilots report sudden radio calls with no origin, controllers see unexplained radar echoes, and occasional phantom flights appear on screens before vanishing again. Whether glitches or glimpses into something stranger, these events show that the skies remain unpredictable. Eyewitness accounts from control towers are perhaps the most unsettling of all ghost flight stories. They come not from sensational tabloids or whispered campfire tales, but from the trained eyes and ears of professionals. These are individuals who dedicate their lives to clarity, yet find themselves confronted by events that defy explanation. In their voices, we hear both bewilderment and awe, reminders that even in the age of radar and satellites, the sky remains capable of surprising us. Ghost flights may never be proven real, but as long as towers continue to report blips that vanish, voices from the past, and aircraft that appear where none should be, the legends will endure. The controllers keep their vigil, staring into the endless horizon, knowing that at any moment history itself might touch down on their runways, only to vanish again into the clouds. Behind every ghost flight, legend lies a more human story. Families left staring at arrival boards that never updated, children waiting at terminals who never saw their parents step off a plane, and letters of condolence written without wreckage or bodies to confirm a final goodbye. While aviation mysteries fascinate us with their eerie impossibilities, it is the human toll that gives them power. The families who waited for planes that never arrived became the first keepers of these legends, their grief-shaping stories that still linger decades later. In the years after World War II, commercial aviation promised connection. Families could cross oceans in hours, reunite across continents, or take holidays once reserved for the wealthy. Tickets were not just pieces of paper, they were promises that loved ones would arrive on time. When those promises were broken by disappearances, the shock reverberated beyond the passengers and crews. Whole networks of families, colleagues and friends were left in limbo. Without the closure of bodies or wreckage, grief hardened into something else, a haunting hope that one day the plane might still return. Take, for example, the families of Flight 19, the squadron of Navy bombers that vanished over the Atlantic in 1945. Their wives and children were given telegrams with the stark words "missing in action," but without evidence, many clung to denial. Some waited for letters that never came. Others told neighbours they still believed the men would fly back one day, explaining their absence as the result of storms, capture, or even secret missions. In this space of uncertainty, the idea of a ghost flight was born, not as sensational folklore, but as a way for families to endure absence. The case of Pan Am Flight 914, said to have disappeared in 1955 only to reappear decades later, illustrates this psychology. Though historians dismiss the story as a tabloid invention, its popularity rests on the very real yearning of families to see the missing walk off a plane long after being declared dead. Imagine a widow reading the first account in a newspaper, a DC-4 appearing suddenly in Caracas, its passengers bewildered to learn it was 1985. For someone who lost a husband in the 1950s, such a story is more than curiosity. It is a spark of hope, however impossible. In Latin America, where ghost flight stories often took root, families sometimes integrated them into rituals of remembrance. On anniversaries of lost flights, candles were lit not just for mourning but for guidance, tiny flames intended to help wandering souls, or even whole planes, find their way back. In villages near the Andes, where aircraft vanished frequently, mothers told children that their fathers were still flying above, circling until the mountains released them. Grief became folklore, and folklore became survival. The waiting was not only emotional, but physical. At Havana's José Martí Airport, families of a vanished 1961 flight reportedly returned for weeks, standing near the arrivals hall each afternoon as if willing the plane to descend. In Miami too, there were accounts of relatives coming back to the terminal years later, not to meet specific flights but to sit in silence, watching the runways. Their presence became a quiet ritual, a way of keeping memory alive in a space where reunion should have happened. Control tower testimonies often intersect with this human side. When a radar operator reported a phantom plane bearing call signs from a vanished decade, news travelled quickly to families. Even if dismissed by officials, such stories ignited old wounds. For every mother who had buried her grief, there was another who whispered, perhaps it was them. Each ghost flight account was not just a mystery, it was a reopening of hope, and with it a reopening of pain. The media played a role as well. Newspapers knew that stories of reappearing planes captured attention because they spoke to loss that many shared. Post-war society was filled with families who had lost someone to the skies, whether in war or in peacetime travel. A headline about a ghost plane landing decades late was not only sensational, it was deeply personal to those whose grief remained unresolved. Some families even clipped these articles, keeping them in drawers alongside photographs of the missing, as though the stories might one day prove true. Psychologists studying ambiguous loss, grief without closure, recognize this as a powerful force. When death is confirmed, mourning can eventually lead to acceptance. But when a plane vanishes without trace, families remain caught between belief and disbelief. They may grieve, but a part of them continues to wait. It is within this space of unresolved grief that ghost flight legends thrive. They are not merely supernatural stories, they are emotional survival mechanisms. Even today, in the age of satellites and near-constant tracking, we have seen echoes of this phenomenon. When Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 disappeared in 2014, families gathered in hotel conference rooms for updates that never came. Many clung to theories, hijacking, secret landings, even time slips, because accepting complete loss without evidence felt unbearable. Modern technology has advanced, but the human heart still struggles with absence. The ghost flight stories of the mid-20th century were precursors to this same longing. When nothing is found, we create narratives that keep the possibility of return alive. Families waiting for lost flights are the human foundation of these legends. Their grief infused the stories with meaning, their hope sustained them, and their inability to let go ensured they would spread. Behind every eerie radar blip, every tale of a decades-late landing, lies the image of a family at an airport terminal, eyes fixed on a doorway that never opens. These stories endure not because we believe in time warps or magnetic anomalies, but because we understand what it means to wait, to hope, and to refuse to accept silence as the final word. Ghost flights are, in the end, not only about planes. They're about the people left behind, their love, their endurance, and their need to imagine that the sky might one day return what it took. Airports are built on precision. Every departure, every arrival, every clearance is timed, logged, and filed. Yet within these temples of order exist records that defy explanation. Entries of aircraft that should not have existed, control tower notes of flights from decades earlier, and runway sightings logged only to vanish from official files. While ghost flights are often spoken of as legends told by families or pilots, some of the most unsettling accounts come not from rumour, but from the meticulous paperwork of airports themselves. These records, stamped and dated, hint that the impossible has occasionally been documented, even if quickly buried. One of the most famous cases is linked to the story of Pan Am Flight 914. According to the legend, when the decades-late DC-4 appeared in Caracas in 1985, its approach was logged by Maiquetía International Airport. Controllers recorded its transponder, runway assignment, and even its brief communication before it taxied back into the sky and vanished. Supposedly, a flight manifest was left behind, yellowed with age, showing passengers booked in 1955. While skeptics argue the story originated in sensational tabloids, the detail that hooks believers is the paperwork. Airports operate on record keeping. If staff log that approach, then the impossible briefly crossed into official reality. Brazil provides another unsettling example. In 1989, Porto Alegre Airport was said to have logged the arrival of Lufthansa Flight 513, the infamous skeleton plane. Tower operators reportedly filed an incident report recording the landing of an aircraft whose flight number had vanished in 1954. When authorities opened the cabin, they found 92 skeletons strapped into seats. The official log, according to some versions of the story, was immediately seized by federal investigators. While no public record remains, the persistence of this detail, the idea that the landing was noted in black and white before being suppressed, keeps the legend alive. Europe too holds whispers of impossible documentation. In the 1980s, controllers at Madrid Barajas reportedly noted the sudden appearance of an unregistered aircraft on their radar, broadcasting call signs from the 1940s. Its descent was tracked, its runway clearance granted, yet when ground crews arrived to guide it in, no plane existed. Controllers swore the event had been logged in daily reports. Later, when questioned, their superiors denied the incident had ever happened. To those involved, the missing paperwork was proof of a cover-up, not a mistake. Even in North America, where aviation oversight is rigorous, similar anomalies have been whispered about. At Miami International in the late 1960s, rumours spread of a DC-3 appearing on final approach, its registration tied to a flight lost in the Caribbean 20 years earlier. Some claim its landing was entered into tower logs, only for the entry to vanish from records days later. Controllers involved later described the strange events surrounding the event, as though colleagues had been warned not to discuss it. What makes these stories chilling is their intersection with bureaucracy. Ghost flights can be dismissed as hallucinations or folklore, but airport logs are supposed to be immune to such subjectivity. When a tower records a flight number, transponder code, or landing time, it becomes part of an official trail. If such details describe planes that should not exist, they blur the line between myth and fact. The very act of logging the impossible transforms rumour into something that, at least briefly, was recognised as real. Skeptics counter that paperwork can be forged, misinterpreted, or sensationalised. They argue that airports handling thousands of flights daily are prone to clerical errors. A mistyped call sign or misread transponder could conjure the illusion of a ghost flight. Yet this explanation falters when eyewitnesses, controllers, ground crew, even passengers waiting at gates corroborate the anomaly. To them, the paperwork is not a mistake but a trace of something inexplicable. The idea of airports recording the impossible also speaks to human psychology. In a world where we expect systems to be infallible, anomalies become all the more terrifying. If even the meticulous records of airports admit a flight that should not exist, then our sense of order collapses. It is not simply a story told in whispers, it is an event logged, time-stamped and signed. And if those logs later disappear, it suggests not error but deliberate suppression, which is often even more unsettling. The persistence of these tales suggests a broader truth. Airports are not just transit hubs, but places where reality is constantly measured, where every second is accounted for. That makes them fertile ground for ghost flight legends. A plane vanishing over the ocean may be forgotten, but a plane appearing on radar, assigned a runway and logged by staff touches the fabric of the system itself. It forces the question, if even our most trusted records can hold the impossible, how much else remains hidden? For families of the lost, these supposed logs offer bittersweet hope. The idea that their loved ones' flights were not destroyed but merely delayed, showing up decades later in an airport's paperwork, allows them to imagine reunions denied by history. Even when debunked, the stories persist because they give shape to grief. A logbook entry becomes not just a bureaucratic note, but a message across time. The missing have not been forgotten, and perhaps they were never truly gone. Today, with digital systems replacing paper, it is harder to imagine such anomalies surviving long. Yet even now, controllers occasionally report phantom blips, aircraft that appear on radar with no corresponding flight plan, only to vanish minutes later. Most are dismissed as glitches, but when several towers report the same anomaly, or when blips align with the path of flights lost decades earlier, the old legends stir again. Somewhere in the data streams of modern aviation may lie entries as inexplicable as those of the past, digital fingerprints of ghost flight still crossing the skies. Airports that recorded the impossible remain a cornerstone of ghost flight lore. Whether their logs are fact, fiction, or a blend of both, they speak to our deepest unease that the systems we trust most may occasionally bear witness to events that cannot be explained. And if the next arrival board were to list a flight from 1955, or a control tower log were to record a vanished aircraft requesting clearance, who among us could say with certainty that it was a mistake? Among all the ghost flight legends, none are more chilling than those that describe planes landing with no living passengers, only skeletons strapped into their seats, as if death itself had taken command of the cockpit. These tales strike at the deepest part of our fears, because they are not just about disappearance or reappearance, but about what happens to those caught in between. When a flight vanishes and returns decades later, the hope of reunion lingers. But when it arrives filled with bones, the mystery becomes darker, the legend heavier. These are the skeleton crew reports, accounts that have circulated across continents, echoing the same eerie pattern. The most infamous of these stories is Brazil's Flight 513. As the legend goes, in October 1989, a Lufthansa Boeing 727, missing since 1954, suddenly appeared in the skies above Porto Alegre. Air traffic controllers were shocked to receive its signal. The call sign matched a flight that had never completed its journey 35 years earlier. The plane landed smoothly, its approach precise, its touchdown flawless. Ground crews rushed to meet it, expecting confused passengers. Instead, when the cabin doors were forced open, they found 92 skeletons seated in place, uniforms still intact to seatbelts fastened. At the controls, the captain's skeletal hands gripped the yoke as if he had guided the plane to its last landing. Skeptics dismissed the story as a fabrication, pointing out that Lufthansa's records list no missing Flight 513 in 1954. Yet the tale has persisted for decades, repeated in magazines, radio broadcasts and online forums. What makes it so enduring is not whether it happened, but how it embodies the ghost flight archetype. The plane returns, but its passengers are beyond saving, their silence speaking louder than any explanation. Other versions of the skeleton crew theme surface in different parts of the world. In Mexico, a story circulates of a Cubana de Aviación flight that vanished in 1961 and was said to reappear 37 years later in Veracruz. When investigators entered the aircraft, they allegedly found only bones, clothing from another era, and luggage tags that matched passengers long since declared dead. The plane, according to the legend, disappeared again before authorities could secure it, leaving only fragments of paperwork behind. In Russia, Cold War folklore tells of a Soviet transport plane that disappeared over Siberia in the 1950s. Decades later, hunters claimed to stumble upon the wreck in a remote forest, but what unsettled them was not the wreckage itself, it was that the bodies inside were mummified in their seats, preserved unnaturally, as though time had slowed within the cabin. Official reports never confirmed the discovery, but the story lingers in oral tradition, part of the broader pattern of skeleton crew tales. These legends are terrifying because they combine two unsettling elements: precision and death. The planes often land perfectly, their engines still humming, their wheels aligned. They behave as though guided by living pilots, yet inside they hold only silence. This paradox, machines performing flawlessly while human life inside has decayed, makes the stories uncanny. They suggest not only that time is unstable, but that technology can outlast us, carrying its dead cargo across decades until finally released. Scientists and skeptics propose explanations rooted in psychology and folklore. Skeleton crew reports may be symbolic, transforming the fear of aviation loss into a physical image, passengers forever trapped in flight. The image of bones in uniforms, hands still on controls, serves as a metaphor for the futility of resisting death in the skies. Some folklorists connect the tales to older maritime legends. Ghost ships like the Mary Celeste were often found adrift with meals still on tables, their crews vanished or dead. The transition from sea to air simply modernized the archetype. Where once sailors found derelict ships with skeletal crews, now airports and towers whispered of planes arriving with the same macabre payload. And yet, for all the explanations, the skeleton crew stories persist because they tap into the deepest unease of flight itself. Passengers board planes trusting that they will emerge hours later into the same world they left. Ghost flight legends destabilize that trust. Skeleton crew tales go further, suggesting that the world may continue but that life inside the plane may not. The aircraft becomes a coffin with wings, delivering not survivors but remains. For families of the missing, such stories bring a complicated form of closure. They are horrific, yet they provide an answer where none existed. To imagine loved ones endlessly circling in the sky is unbearable. To believe they at least landed, even as bones, is strangely easier. These legends thus serve as emotional scaffolding, allowing grief to take shape. In Brazil, families of missing flights sometimes referred to Flight 513 as a warning that their relatives might one day return in silence, their fate sealed but not forgotten. The skeleton crew reports also carry cultural resonance because they suggest time itself can preserve tragedy. The idea that passengers can remain seated for decades, clothing intact, is absurd to science but powerful in story. It transforms death into endurance, suggesting that those lost in the skies are not erased but held somewhere, waiting to be seen again. The discovery of wrecks decades later, planes found in glaciers or jungles with the remains still inside, only reinforces this imagery. Reality and legend blur, each feeding the other. Ultimately, the skeleton crew tales remind us that ghost flights are not just about disappearance or reappearance. They're about what waits inside when the doors open. Will passengers walk out confused but alive, as in some stories? Or will investigators step into a cabin filled only with silence and bone? That uncertainty is what gives the legends their enduring power. Whether or not Brazil's Flight 513 ever landed with 92 skeletons aboard, the story lives on because it encapsulates the darkest possibility of flight, that we may reach our destination perfectly on time, but with no one left to step off the plane. And as long as aircraft vanish without a trace, the image of skeleton crews strapped in their seats will haunt the imagination, a chilling reminder that some journeys end not with arrival but with eternal silence in the skies. When the first ghost flight stories emerged, planes vanishing into clear skies, only to reappear decades later, the search for explanations began almost immediately. Weather, magnetic anomalies, pilot error, all were invoked, but none seemed to account for the most bizarre details. How could an aircraft land decades after takeoff with passengers unchanged? How could skeleton crews guide planes to flawless landings? For some, the answer lay not in meteorology or engineering, but in physics at its most speculative. Perhaps these ghost flights were not accidents of navigation, but slips between dimensions. The idea of interdimensional travel is as old as human imagination. Folklore across cultures tells of people stepping into forests, caves, or fogs and emerging into another realm, or returning years later, unchanged, to a world that has aged without them. In the 20th century, these ancient stories fused with modern science. Theories of parallel universes, wormholes, and alternate timelines gave a framework to old myths. And ghost flights, vanishing in skies where no wreckage could be found, fits seamlessly into this narrative. One of the strongest arguments for interdimensional travel comes from the accounts of aircraft that reappear long after being declared lost. The Pan Am Flight 914 story is the archetype. A DC-4 that supposedly took off in 1955, vanished en route to Miami, and landed in Caracas 30 years later with passengers unaware of the time that had passed. To skeptics, it was tabloid fiction. To believers, it was evidence of a plane that had slipped into another dimension, continuing its journey in a parallel stream of time before returning. In this view, the passengers' confusion makes sense. They never left their flight path. Only reality around them shifted. Another case often tied to interdimensional speculation is Brazil's Flight 513, the skeleton flight. Here, the paradox is even sharper. The plane vanished in 1954, but landed in 1989 with no living passengers, only remains. For some theorists, this suggests the aircraft slipped into another dimension where time flowed differently, consuming the passengers but leaving the machine intact. The eerie detail of the captain's skeletal hand still gripping the controls becomes symbolic, a pilot guiding his plane across not just space, but realities. Scientific speculation lends the theory a sheen of plausibility. Quantum physics has long entertained the possibility of multiple universes, infinite realities layered atop one another like pages in a book. If so, then perhaps the skies contain thin places where those layers brush together. An aircraft entering such a zone could fall through, not into destruction, but into a neighbouring world. If the alignment shifts again, the plane might re-emerge into its original universe, though not necessarily at the same point in time. A flight lost in 1955 might exit in 1985, decades displaced. Wormholes predicted by Einstein's equations offer another avenue of thought. These theoretical tunnels through space-time could connect distant points instantaneously. If a natural or artificial wormhole intersected with Earth's atmosphere, an aircraft could stumble into it, vanishing from radar in one location and reappearing elsewhere, or else being held within the tunnel until conditions allowed release. The absence of wreckage in many ghost flight cases fits neatly with this explanation. The plane is not destroyed, it is simply gone, waiting in the folds of another dimension. Skeptics counter that these theories are leaps of imagination, not supported by evidence. They argue that parallel universes and wormholes remain unproven, and applying them to aviation legends is little more than science fiction. Yet even skeptics acknowledge the psychological appeal. Interdimensional travel offers a way to transform tragedy into mystery, to replace destruction with displacement. Families mourning vanished, loved ones may prefer to imagine them alive somewhere else, trapped in another realm rather than drowned in the sea. Folklorists note the continuity between these modern stories and ancient myths. The Celtic idea of fairy mounds, where time passed differently, echoes in ghost flights that land decades late. Japanese legends of people entering mountain paths and returning centuries afterward mirror the tales of planes emerging from clouds into futures not their own. What once was explained as the work of spirits is now reframed as the effect of dimensions. The technology changes, but the human need for explanation remains. Theories of interdimensional travel also reflect cultural anxieties of the 20th century. During the Cold War, when secrecy and advanced technology dominated public imagination, ghost flights were often explained as victims of hidden experiments, planes accidentally pulled into dimensions by government research. In the age of quantum physics, they are recast as evidence of parallel worlds. The legends evolve with the science of the time, always borrowing the language of the frontier to explain the inexplicable. What makes these theories compelling is not their scientific rigor, but their symmetry with the stories themselves. A plane that disappears without wreckage, then reappears decades later, fits no conventional explanation. But in a multiverse where time and space are porous, it makes sense. A radar blip appearing from nowhere, an outdated aircraft circling a modern runway, a pilot identifying his flight as if still in the past, these anomalies feel less like accidents than glimpses of another reality breaking through. Ultimately, whether one believes in interdimensional travel or not, the theory serves a vital role in ghost flight lore. It bridges the gap between grief and wonder, between the impossibility of total disappearance and the yearning for explanation. It allows us to imagine that the missing are not lost but displaced, passengers on journeys that continue beyond our reach. Perhaps no scientific breakthrough will ever confirm these stories. Perhaps the skies will remain mysterious, their legends unprovable. But as long as planes vanish without a trace, the idea of interdimensional travel will remain close at hand. It is an answer that satisfies not because it is certain, but because it keeps the door open, because it whispers that somewhere, in another dimension, the engines of lost flights are still humming, their passengers still waiting for a runway that will finally bring them home. As ghost flight legends spread through the mid-20th century, they began to overlap with another phenomenon that was quickly capturing the public imagination. UFOs, sightings of strange lights in the sky, mysterious radar blips, and accounts of aircraft vanishing without a trace, soon merged into a shared mythology. For some, ghost flights were not products of storms or magnetic anomalies at all, but encounters with forces beyond Earth. If unidentified flying objects could abduct individuals, why not entire planes? And if those planes later reappeared decades late, might UFOs explain both their disappearance and their return? The connection between UFOs and ghost flights often begins with timing. The first modern wave of UFO reports began in 1947, just 2 years after the infamous disappearance of Flight 19 in the Bermuda Triangle. Newspapers that covered both stories noted uncanny similarities: planes vanishing from radar, pilots reporting strange visuals before radio silence, and search efforts that yielded nothing. As UFO fever spread in the late 1940s and 50s, it was natural for the mysteries of vanished aircraft to be woven into the same tapestry. Witness testimony reinforced the link. Pilots sometimes reported seeing lights pursuing their planes moments before instruments failed. In one case in the early 1960s, a Brazilian cargo pilot claimed that luminous orbs surrounded his aircraft, causing his compass to spin wildly. He survived, but he later remarked that he felt as though something was pulling us away. When other planes did not return at all, it was easy for families and enthusiasts to imagine the same scenario, except with no survivors to tell the tale. The skeleton crew stories fit particularly well with UFO lore. Brazil's Flight 513, said to have landed in 1989 with nothing but bones inside, is often cited by UFO theorists as evidence of extraterrestrial intervention. The argument runs that the passengers were taken, studied, abducted, or simply removed, while the plane itself was returned, a kind of eerie calling card. The fact that the aircraft was said to have landed perfectly as though guided by invisible hands only deepened speculation that some intelligence beyond human had been at work. Another case often tied to UFOs is Pan Am Flight 914. If one accepts the legend that the DC-4 took off in 1955 and landed in 1985, the idea of a time slip or dimensional portal is one explanation. But UFO theorists see it differently. What if the plane was taken aboard a craft, suspended or displaced for decades, and then set free? The bewildered passengers, still dressed in their 1950s clothing, could be seen as evidence of abduction at a scale far greater than individual encounters. Cold War skies provided fertile ground for such stories. Surveillance aircraft frequently reported unidentified objects shadowing them. Radar operators described blips moving at impossible speeds, sometimes appearing directly beside friendly planes before vanishing. In a few incidents, entire flights disappeared from radar moments after such sightings. Official reports usually attributed these to malfunctions or enemy interference, but UFO researchers seized on them as proof that advanced craft were plucking planes from the sky. The UFO connection also appealed to a cultural longing for explanation. Families of the missing struggled with silence. Governments were often reluctant to admit failures or accidents, leaving grieving relatives with little closure. UFO theories offered an alternative. Their loved ones were not drowned or shattered, but taken. Terrifying though it was, this explanation at least gave meaning to the vanishing, placing it within a narrative rather than leaving it as empty chaos. Skeptics countered that no material evidence tied UFOs to ghost flights. No wreckage bore signs of alien interference, and no declassified files confirmed abductions on such a scale. But for believers, the lack of evidence was part of the proof. If extraterrestrials had the ability to take entire aircraft, surely they could also erase traces. And if governments knew, surely they would cover it up to prevent panic. Thus, the UFO theory grew stronger the less it could be disproven. The overlap of ghost flight and UFO lore shaped popular culture as well. Films and television shows in the 1960s and 70s dramatized disappearing planes whisked away by saucers. Science fiction novels imagined airports receiving landings from decades-lost flights, their passengers dazed, their stories incomplete. Documentaries blurred the line between ghost flights and alien abductions, presenting both as facets of the same unsolved mystery. Each retelling reinforced the connection until, in the public mind, the two became inseparable. Even today, when UFOs are more often discussed in the language of military sightings and advanced technology, the old link to ghost flights persists. Enthusiasts point to recent declassified footage of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, and suggest that the same forces responsible for baffling Navy pilots today could have been behind the vanishing of entire aircraft in the past. If UAPs can outmaneuver modern jets, they reason, what chance did a 1940s or 50s propeller plane have when caught in their path? Ultimately, the UFO connection to ghost flights reflects humanity's search for answers in the face of the incomprehensible. When planes disappear without wreckage, and when stories tell of their impossible return, conventional explanations falter. UFOs fill that void with a narrative that is at once terrifying and strangely comforting. Terrifying because it suggests forces beyond our control. Comforting because it means the lost may not be destroyed, only taken elsewhere. Whether one accepts or rejects the idea, the link between UFOs and ghost flights continues to fuel speculation. Each mystery in the sky becomes a canvas on which we project our fears and hopes of abduction, of survival, of contact with the unknown. And so long as planes vanish into silence, there will be those who look upward and wonder if the night sky hides not just stars, but the watchers who hold our flights in their grasp. By the 1970s, Commercial aviation had entered an age of speed and spectacle. The Concorde, with its slender nose and delta wings, symbolized a new future, crossing the Atlantic in half the time of traditional jets, carrying celebrities and diplomats in luxury. It was a marvel of engineering, a supersonic arrow piercing through the skies. Yet even this technological triumph did not escape the gravity of ghost flight legends. Among the myths that circulated in the late 20th century, one of the most unusual was that of a Concorde that vanished mid-flight, only to reappear years later, its passengers unchanged. The story was first whispered in European aviation circles in the 1980s. According to the tale, a Concorde left Paris bound for New York on a routine flight. It reached cruising altitude Mach 2, engines roaring with the smooth thunder of Rolls-Royce/Snecma Olympus 593S. Then somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, contact was lost. Radar screens showed the plane one moment and blank the next. Controllers attempted to reach the pilots, but no response came. Search efforts were dispatched, though the Concorde's speed and altitude made tracking difficult. Yet nothing was found. No debris, no signals, no oil slicks on the water. Weeks later, newspapers hinted at a possible cover-up. Some claimed that military radar in the Azores tracked the Concorde briefly, then lost it again, as if it had re-entered and exited reality. The official record remained silent, and families of the supposed passengers were told only of unexplained disappearance. The myth might have faded, another tale of loss, had it not been for the second half of the story. According to the legend, years later, accounts vary between 5 and 10, the same Concorde suddenly appeared on approach to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. Controllers were stunned. The registration number matched the plane that had vanished years earlier. Communication crackled through, but the voices of the crew sounded calm, as though unaware of any anomaly. They believed they were still on their scheduled transatlantic crossing. When told the year, confusion spread in the cockpit. The aircraft landed smoothly, its tires screeching against the runway. A triumph of engineering guided to Earth by hands that believed no time had passed. Ground crews were said to be shaken by what they found. Passengers emerged wearing fashions of the 1970s, their tickets dated to the day of the disappearance. Some were disoriented, insisting that only hours had gone by. Others, upon realizing the truth, collapsed into shock. Families who had buried them years earlier were stunned to see them alive. Officials, the legend continues, quickly intervened. Passengers were whisked away, the plane confiscated and records sealed. Newspapers never reported it, but in hushed tones the vanished Concorde became one of aviation's most modern ghost flight myths. Skeptics dismissed the story outright. No Concorde was ever recorded as missing. Every flight, from its introduction in 1976 to its retirement in 2003, is documented. The fleet was small, just 14 production aircraft in service, making it impossible for one to vanish without international notice. Aviation historians note that the Concorde was too iconic, too closely monitored, for such a disappearance to go unnoticed. Yet the myth persists, because it carries all the ingredients of ghost flight lore: a vanished aircraft, a sudden reappearance, and passengers out of time. What gives the Concorde myth particular resonance is the symbolism of the aircraft itself. Unlike the aging DC-3s or wartime transports often tied to ghost flight stories does, the Concorde represented progress, speed and certainty. If even this pinnacle of technology could vanish into thin air, then no machine was safe. For many, the legend of the disappearing Concorde was less about fact than about the fragility of human achievement. Supersonic flight was supposed to conquer the skies, yet the myth suggested the skies still had the power to conquer us. Some theorists wove the Concorde myth into broader narratives of time slips and interdimensional travel. They argued that the jet's supersonic speed and high altitude might have pushed it into a zone where time behaved differently. Travelling at twice the speed of sound, skimming the edge of the stratosphere, perhaps the Concorde brushed against a fold in reality. Others tied the tale to UFO lore, suggesting that the aircraft was intercepted by unknown forces, studied, and returned years later. These interpretations, while fantastical, gave the myth a scientific flavour that appealed to those already fascinated by ghost flights. The Concorde myth also reflects the anxieties of its era. In the 1970s and 80s, as the world grew accustomed to rapid technological progress, there was an undercurrent of unease. Supersonic flight promised speed, but it also carried dangers: noise pollution, fuel costs, and environmental concerns. Stories of a Concorde vanishing tapped into those anxieties, turning technological wonder into cautionary tale. The ghost flight legend became a symbolic reminder that even humanity's most advanced creations might be vulnerable to forces beyond comprehension. Though no evidence supports the myth, its endurance shows how ghost flight stories adapt with time. The DC-3s and war transports of earlier decades reflected the uncertainties of early aviation. By the late 20th century, the Concorde myth carried those same uncertainties into the jet age. The machine changed, but the fear remained, that the skies hold mysteries technology cannot master. Today, the legend of the disappearing Concorde is often recounted in the same breath as Pan Am Flight 914 or Brazil's Flight 513. It has become part of the same family of tales, standing as a bridge between the folklore of propeller planes and the anxieties of modern jets. While historians dismiss it, storytellers preserve it because it reminds us of the fragility of certainty. The Concorde was meant to embody progress, elegance, and control. In the myth, it instead becomes a ghost, slipping between years, its passengers caught in a temporal loop. Whether seen as science fiction, conspiracy theory, or folklore, the disappearing and reappearing Concorde stands as one of the strangest echoes in aviation legend, an elegant supersonic arrow that for a moment was said to pierce not just the skies, but time itself. From the moment humans first lifted into the air, a quiet fear has followed every flight. What if we never return? For sailors, the sea had long carried that dread, but by the 20th century the sky became the new frontier of disappearance. Unlike trains or ships, which left wreckage behind, planes could vanish utterly, swallowed by clouds, mountains, or oceans. That possibility, the sudden erasure of lives, machines, and stories, grew into a cultural fear that still shapes ghost flight legends today. In the early decades of aviation, newspapers were filled with reports of missing aircraft. Names like Amelia Earhart became symbols of mystery, her disappearance in 1937 transforming her from pioneer to legend. Every missing pilot reminded the public that flight, while miraculous, was precarious. For families, the grief of loss was compounded by the absence of closure. No bodies, no wreckage, just silence. Out of that silence, the imagination rushed to fill the void. Some believed the missing had crashed, others whispered they had crossed into another realm. Each disappearance became more than an accident. It became a story about what might lie beyond the reach of radar and reason. By mid-century, as commercial air travel expanded, the fear of vanishing entered the collective psyche of ordinary people. Airports became spaces of both wonder and dread. Passengers trusted the promise of tickets and timetables, but deep down, many carried the question, what if my flight never lands? This anxiety was amplified by real cases. Flights disappeared over the Andes, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. Each headline reinforced the idea that the sky, unlike the road or warm sea, could erase people entirely. The Bermuda Triangle emerged as the cultural symbol of this fear. After the disappearance of Flight 19 in 1945, followed by other vanishings, the region became a shorthand for the sky's unpredictability. Even those who dismissed the supernatural could not shake the notion that flying over certain areas carried risks beyond explanation. Popular books and documentaries in the 1960s and 70s turned the triangle into a household phrase, ensuring that millions associated air travel with the possibility of vanishing. Ghost flight legends thrive in this atmosphere of cultural fear. A plane disappearing is terrifying enough, but a plane reappearing decades later, its passengers unchanged or reduced to skeletons, plays directly into our anxieties about time, death, and the unknown. These stories dramatize what we most fear, that we might be carried away not simply into death, but into mystery. Unlike a crash, which offers finality, a vanishing leaves us suspended in uncertainty. The legends become a way of processing that suspension. Psychologists note that fear of disappearance is tied to a deeper fear of erasure. Human beings long for continuity, to be remembered, to leave a trace. When planes vanish, they seem to defy that longing, obliterating evidence and memory. Ghost flight stories paradoxically ease the fear by reintroducing the missing into the narrative. Even if they return as skeleton crews or bewildered passengers out of time, at least they return. At least they are not erased entirely. This fear is not confined to those who fly. For families waiting at terminals, the anxiety of vanishing is even sharper. Every delayed arrival, Every sudden announcement over the intercom taps into an old unease. The boarding gate becomes a stage where hopes and fears collide. Loved ones may step through the doorway, or they may never arrive. For many families of real-life disappearances, ghost flight stories become symbols of possibility. They may never see wreckage, but the idea that the lost could reappear keeps hope alive, however painful. Culturally, the fear of vanishing also reflects the tension between progress and vulnerability. Aviation was meant to symbolize mastery of the skies, triumph over gravity, yet the more advanced flight became, the more shocking it was when planes disappeared. If technology could not guarantee safety, then perhaps something larger was at work, forces beyond human control. Ghost flights embody this tension, reminding us that no matter how powerful our machine, we remain at the mercy of the unknown. The persistence of these fears explains why ghost flights remain popular in films, novels, and documentaries. They allow audiences to confront the possibility of disappearance from a safe distance. In stories, planes can return, questions can be asked, mysteries can be explored. In real life, the silence is far more crushing. Legends fill the gap between reality and imagination, making sense of what otherwise feels senseless. Even in the modern age of satellites and GPS, the fear has not vanished. The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 in 2014 reignited global awareness of aviation's fragility. In an age when we expect constant tracking, the idea that a large jetliner could vanish without explanation stunned the world. For many, it was proof that the old cultural fear was not outdated. The sky still holds the power to erase. And just as in earlier decades, ghost flight theories emerged, time slips, UFOs, secret landings, because the alternative, an unanswered void, was unbearable. Ultimately, the cultural fear of vanishing in the sky is not only about planes, it is about our relationship with the unknown. The sky represents freedom, progress, and connection, but also absence, loss, and sidamson. Ghost flight stories endure because they articulate this duality. They allow us to imagine what might happen if the sky's silence could be broken, if the vanished could return, if disappearance were not the final word. Every time we step onto a plane, the fear lingers, however faint. We trust the engines, the pilots, the systems, but deep down we know the truth. The sky is vast and not everything returns from it. Ghost flights are the stories born from that knowledge, the cultural echo of our deepest unease, the reminder that to fly is always, in some way, to risk vanishing. Not every ghost flight tale begins with a plane that reappears decades later. Some start with real tragedies, air disasters etched into history, that over time transform into legends. Wreckage is found, causes determined, families mourn. Yet even when official explanations exist, folklore creeps in. Rumours of survivors lost in the wilderness, of planes seen years later still flying, or of ghostly echoes on radar blur the line between fact and myth. In this way, disasters become more than accidents. They become enduring stories that continue to haunt long after the final report is filed. One of the most powerful examples is the 1972 crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, known as the Miracle of the Andes. The plane carrying a rugby team struck a mountain and broke apart on the snow. Survivors endured impossible conditions, their ordeal later revealed in harrowing detail. But alongside the facts grew myths, that the plane was cursed, that ghostly lights guided the survivors, and that other vanished flights might still be frozen in glaciers nearby, waiting to be uncovered. While this case was explained in full, it fed into broader Andean legends of planes disappearing into ice only to return, preserved by the mountain's grip. In Alaska, where aviation is a lifeline across remote wilderness, numerous crashes have been absorbed into ghost flight folklore. Small planes lost in blizzards were later said to be seen flying low over valleys, their engines sputtering as if from another time. When wreckage was eventually discovered, these sightings were often dismissed as mistaken identity. Yet the stories persisted, attaching to the disasters like shadows. Locals told of pilots who never realized they had crashed, continuing to fly their routes in spectral form. Some legends grow from disasters that remain unsolved. In 1947, a British South American Airways plane named Stardust vanished in the Andes. For decades, no trace was found. Families lived with silence and rumours spread. The plane had slipped into another dimension, or had landed secretly in an undisclosed location. In 2000, mountaineers finally discovered wreckage emerging from glacial ice, confirming the crash site. But even then, the folklore did not die. The fact that the wreckage reappeared half a century later seemed to validate the idea that planes might return after decades, their stories unfinished. The transformation of disasters into legends is often tied to grief. For families, official reports rarely provide comfort. A mechanical failure or pilot error may explain how a loved one was lost, but it does not satisfy the deeper need for meaning. Folklore offers a different kind of closure. In ghost flight tales, the lost are not destroyed but displaced. Even when bodies are found, the idea persists that the souls of the passengers, or even the aircraft itself, still travel echoing through the skies. Another striking case is Eastern Airlines Flight 401, which crashed into the Florida Everglades in 1972. Investigators determined the cause. The crew became distracted by a faulty landing gear light, and the plane descended unnoticed into the swamp. But in the years that followed, stories spread of Flight 401's ghosts appearing on other Eastern aircraft. Passengers and crew swore they saw uniformed figures in cockpits and galleys, identified as the lost pilots and attendants. Some even claimed that parts salvaged from the wreckage and reused in other planes carried the spirits with them. Here, a real disaster grew into one of aviation's most famous ghost legends, blending tragedy with haunting. Cultural storytelling amplifies these transformations. Films, documentaries, and novels often dramatize disasters, emphasizing mystery over fact. Each retelling strips away technical explanations and highlights the eerie. Over time, the line between documented accident and ghost flight legend fades. For the public, it matters less what caused the disaster than what it symbolizes. The fragility of life in the skies and the possibility that those lost might not be gone forever. Skeptics argue that such legends distort history, distracting from real lessons learned. Safety procedures and technological improvements often arise from studying disasters in detail. By turning crashes into myths, we risk overlooking the progress made. Yet others counter that legends serve a different purpose. They give voice to emotions statistics cannot capture. The families of victims do not remember flight numbers or technical faults. They remember absence. Legends allow that absence to be filled with something, fear, hope, or wonder, rather than nothing at all. Air disasters turned into legends also reflect humanity's relationship with flight itself. We marvel at its triumphs but remain uneasy with its risks. Each crash is a reminder that despite radar, satellites, and engineering, the skies remain unpredictable. Legends soften that reminder, shifting the narrative from failure to mystery. A vanished plane becomes not a symbol of error, but of the unknown, an enduring story that keeps the memory alive. In this way, ghost flights and real disasters intertwine. Some ghost flight legends may have begun as distortions of real crashes, their details warped by time and retelling. Conversely, some disasters become ghost stories because people cannot bear to leave them as accidents. The two feed each other, ensuring that every tragedy in the skies has the potential to echo far beyond its date. Ultimately, air disasters turned into legends remind us that flight is not just a matter of engineering and schedules. It is a deeply human act, fraught with hope and fear. When planes crash, we mourn. When they vanish, we imagine. And when their stories return as legends, we reveal our refusal to let the skies have the final word. While ghost flights began as whispered stories among pilots, controllers, and grieving families, they eventually escaped the confines of aviation folklore and found their way into popular media. Newspapers, magazines, radio shows, films, and later television all seized upon the eerie appeal of planes vanishing and reappearing, reshaping these stories into cultural myths. Over time, ghost flights stopped being just anomalies in logbooks or grief-born legends. They became fixtures of entertainment, cautionary tales, and symbols of the unknown. The earliest media fascination with ghost flights dates back to the mid-20th century, when sensational newspapers and pulp magazines discovered their power to shock. Publications in the 1950s and 60s thrived on headlines about planes that supposedly landed decades late or arrived with skeleton crews. Many of the most famous legends, such as Pan Am Flight 914 or Brazil's Flight 513, owe their longevity not to official records but to their circulation in these outlets. Tabloid illustrations showed bewildered passengers stepping off jets into futures not their own. or police peering into cabins lined with bones. These stories blurred the line between news and fiction, but they resonated because they tapped into collective anxieties about technology and the fragility of air travel. Radio soon amplified the legends. Paranormal programs of the 1960s and 70s frequently featured interviews with supposed witnesses, building entire episodes around ghost flights. For audiences who had grown accustomed to hearing routine aviation updates over the airwaves, the idea that planes could reappear from nowhere felt unnervingly plausible. Listeners were enthralled not just by the strangeness of the stories, but by their immediacy. The voices of tower operators or passengers' relatives describing events as if they had happened only yesterday. Television brought ghost flights into living rooms worldwide. Documentaries in the 1970s capitalized on the rise of interest in the Bermuda Triangle, linking it directly to mysterious flight disappearances. Programs like In Search Of, narrated by Leonard Nimoy, dramatized cases like Flight 19, complete with reenactments of frantic radio calls and ominous music. For many viewers, this was their first introduction to the idea that planes might slip out of existence only to return years later. The blend of scientific speculation and eerie dramatization gave the legends a new legitimacy, even if the evidence remained thin. The silver screen also played its part. Hollywood wove ghost flight themes into films that blurred science fiction with horror. While The Philadelphia Experiment, 1984, focused on naval legends, its portrayal of time slips and disappearances fed directly into the cultural association between government experiments and vanishing aircraft. More subtly, disaster films of the 1970s, such as Airport 19-77, exploited the public's fear of planes vanishing to crashing in unthinkable scenarios. Though not strictly ghost flight stories, these films leaned heavily on the same anxieties: that modern technology could fail spectacularly, leaving lives suspended between survival and mystery. By the late 20th century, ghost flights had become recurring motifs in television dramas. Episodes of shows like The Twilight Zone and later The X-Files explored planes vanishing into alternate dimensions, only to reappear with passengers unchanged. These narratives mirrored real ghost flight legends, but presented them through the lens of speculative fiction, giving audiences both chills and the reassurance of fiction. In these shows, ghost flights were not just accidents, they were metaphors for humanity's fragile grip on reality and time. Literature, too, embraced the theme. Writers of both fiction and non-fiction devoted entire books to mysterious disappearances, often blending genuine aviation accidents with folkloric ghost flight accounts. The Bermuda Triangle genre exploded in the 1960s and 70s, with works by Charles Berlitz and others presenting ghost flight tales alongside shipwrecks and vanishings. While critics dismissed much of this as pseudoscience, the books became bestsellers, ensuring that ghost flights entered mainstream imagination as part of a larger narrative about Earth's hidden dangers. As the internet age dawned, ghost flights found a new stage. Online forums, YouTube videos, and digital documentaries resurrected old tales and introduced them to younger audiences. Short videos dramatizing Pan Am 914 or Flight 513, complete with CGI reenactments, spread rapidly, often presented as if they were factual. Social media ensured these stories traveled faster than ever, mixing folklore with conspiracy theory. For many, their first encounter with ghost flight lore came not from a book or a TV show, but from a viral post asking, "What if a plane could take off in 1955 and land in 1985? Popular media has also reframed ghost flights as metaphors for broader themes. Films and novels use them to explore grief, time, and the fear of erasure. The idea of passengers stepping off into a world decades older than they remember speaks to anxieties about mortality and change. Skeleton crew stories dramatize our dread of death in transit, of technology outlasting its operators. In this sense, ghost flights are not just entertainment, they are symbolic stories through which we process the cultural fear of vanishing in the sky. Critics argue that media sensationalism has distorted the truth. Many ghost flight stories originated in pulp fiction and were later presented as fact. By blending real disappearances with invented details, the media created a folklore so potent it overshadows actual history. Yet this distortion is part of what gives the legends their cultural staying power. Ghost flights endure not because they are verifiable, but because they were told, retold, and dramatized until they became archetypes of mystery. Ultimately, the role of popular media in ghost flight legends cannot be overstated. Without the tabloids, radio dramatizations, documentaries, and viral videos, these stories might have faded into obscurity. Instead, they have become fixtures of cultural imagination, recognizable across generations and continents. Whether presented as chilling fact or speculative fiction, ghost flights continue to haunt us because they embody our unease with flight time and the unknown. Every era has reshaped them to fit its anxieties. In the 1950s, they reflected post-war grief. In the Cold War, they spoke to fears of secrecy and experiment. In the 21st century, they thrive online, feeding the endless appetite for unexplained phenomena. Ghost flights in popular media are more than stories. They are mirrors, reflecting both our fascination with technology and our fear that the sky may still hold mysteries we cannot explain. The power of ghost flight stories lies not only in their strangeness, but in how often reality seems to echo them. While tales of planes vanishing and reappearing decades later may belong to folklore, there are enough real-life incidents of delayed arrivals, unexpected returns, and baffling disappearances to blur the line between myth and truth. These moments, when documented events mimic the legends, give ghost flights their enduring weight. They remind us that the impossible sometimes looks uncomfortably close to possible. One of the most striking examples occurred in 1970, when Eastern Airlines Flight 401 vanished briefly from radar while flying into Miami. The plane did not disappear for decades, nor did it return with skeletons aboard. But for minutes that felt like an eternity. It was gone. No signal, no contact, no trace. Controllers feared the worst until suddenly the blip reappeared, the aircraft continuing as though nothing had happened. Passengers later recalled strange turbulence and lights flickering in the cabin, though no mechanical failure was ever confirmed. The incident became a precursor to the haunting stories that followed after the plane's eventual crash in 1972, when ghost sightings of its crew were reported on other aircraft. Reality did not match the myth exactly, but it rhymed with it. Similarly, the 1978 disappearance of Frederick Valentich in Australia reads almost like a script for a ghost flight tale. Flying a small Cessna over the Bass Strait, Valentich radioed air traffic control to report being shadowed by a strange object. His final words were chilling. "It's not an aircraft, it's hovering, and it's not an aircraft." Moments later, contact was lost. Despite extensive searches, no wreckage was ever found. To this day, his disappearance remains unexplained. The mythic resonance is clear. A pilot vanishes mid-air, possibly into another realm, his last transmission filled with dread. It is not a plane reappearing decades later, but it is close enough to feed the same unease. In 1999, a Boeing 727 parked in Angola was stolen from an airport and flown into the sky without authorization. Despite radar and international surveillance, the aircraft was never seen again. Unlike folklore, this was not a case of time slips or phantom returns. It was an actual jetliner, in the modern age of satellites and global tracking, vanishing as if into thin air. The story struck the world because it sounded like myth breaking into reality, a large, unmistakable aircraft gone without explanation. The most sobering modern echo of the ghost flight lore came in 2014 with Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. In an age when every commercial aircraft is equipped with transponders, GPS, and near-constant communication, the disappearance seemed impossible. Yet the plane vanished over the Indian Ocean with 239 souls aboard, its signals lost, its wreckage absent for years. For families, the grief was unbearable, not only because of the loss, but because of the silence. The cultural memory of ghost flights resurfaced immediately. Online discussions speculated about time slips, abductions, and dimensional anomalies. In this case, reality itself provided a mystery that mirrored legend, a passenger jet, modern and monitored, gone as if the sky had simply erased it. Even less tragic incidents echo the myths. In 1954, a Lockheed Constellation flying from New York to Caracas was delayed by hours due to storms. When it finally landed, passengers were stunned to find that their watches and the airport clocks disagreed by a significant margin. The discrepancy was eventually explained by radio miscommunications and time zone confusion, but for a moment, the illusion of a ghost flight was palpable. To those waiting at the terminal, it was as though the plane had slipped out of time, arriving not hours but decades too late. What ties these real cases to legend is the human response. Whenever planes disappear or behave strangely, we turn not just to science, but to story. Explanations like mechanical failure or weather rarely satisfy. We crave deeper meaning, even if it unsettles us. When Valentich vanished, people said he was taken. When MH370 went missing, people whispered about dimensional corridors. These stories endure not because we reject science, but because the silence of disappearance demands more than data. It demands narrative. There is also a psychological comfort in myth. To believe a lost plane slipped into another dimension is, paradoxically, easier than accepting it was destroyed without trace. Folklore keeps the possibility of survival, however bizarre, alive. Even skeleton crew stories offer a kind of closure. The dead may be gone, but they return, their fate visible rather than erased. In this way, reality mimicking myth is not accidental. It is inevitable, because our minds insist on shaping mystery into something we can tell. When we look back across the history of aviation, we see countless echoes. The Andes releasing wreckage of planes decades later, glaciers unveiling perfectly preserved fuselages, airports logging phantom flights, all blur the boundary between fact and folklore. Each new disappearance revives the old legends, layering reality with myth until the two are indistinguishable. Ultimately, ghost flight stories endure because reality gives them fuel. Disappearances like MH370, eerie vanishings like Valentich's, or sudden reappearances from glaciers make the idea of ghost flights plausible, even if not proven. The myth thrives because the sky itself sometimes behaves like legend. And so, when a plane vanishes, we are left with two stories: the official one of malfunction, weather, or error, and the folkloric one of time slips, abductions, or returns. Both coexist, both satisfy different needs, and both ensure that ghost flights remain alive in our culture. For when reality mimics myth, the impossible no longer feels so far away. As the final chapter in this long arc of mysteries, legends, and theories, one question remains: why do ghost flights continue to fascinate us? From the first whispers of vanished squadrons to the viral retellings of planes landing decades late, these stories have never lost their grip on imagination. Even in an age of satellites, GPS, and near-constant surveillance, the idea that an aircraft might vanish or reappear unchanged decades later still captivates millions. The endurance of ghost flights lies not only in their mystery, but in what they reveal about our fears, our hopes, and our need for meaning in the face of the sky's silence. At the core of their power is the primal fear of disappearance. To lose someone in a crash, though devastating, brings closure. Bodies, wreckage, and explanation. But to lose them without a trace is far worse. Families are left in limbo, unable to mourn fully, caught between hope and despair. Ghost flight legends emerge in this vacuum, filling silence with story. A vanished plane becomes not the end of life, but a passage to elsewhere, another time, another dimension, or even a suspended state from which it might one day return. Legends endure because they promise that absence is not final. Ghost flights also endure because they dramatize the fragility of technology. Aviation was once the pinnacle of human progress, proof that we had conquered gravity and distance. Yet every vanishing reminds us that our machines, however advanced, are vulnerable. A Boeing 727 stolen from an Angolan airport, never seen again. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, disappearing in the digital age as if mocking our sense of control. When the most sophisticated systems fail, we seek explanations beyond human error. Ghost flights embody this unease, turning technological triumph into mythic vulnerability. The stories also persist because they blur the line between the natural and the supernatural. Scientific theories, magnetic anomalies, time distortions, wormholes sound as fantastical as folklore. When real pilots describe compasses spinning or controllers log flights with outdated call signs, it is easy to imagine the impossible. The legends take root not because they are provable, but because they exist in the liminal space between science and wonder. Ghost flights endure because they remind us that the world is stranger than we like to admit. Culturally, ghost flights serve as metaphors. They represent more than missing aircraft, they symbolize the human condition itself. To step onto a plane is to trust in systems beyond our control, to surrender to the vastness of sky and fate. Ghost flight stories mirror this surrender, dramatizing our deepest anxieties, that we may set out on familiar journeys only to find ourselves lost in a world we no longer recognize. They are, in essence, stories about mortality, displacement, and the fragile thread of continuity that keeps us tethered to the present. Media has played a crucial role in their survival. Tabloids of the 1950s exaggerated reports, radio dramatizations in the 1960s spread them, and television in the 1970s etched them into cultural memory. Later, the internet revived old legends with new audiences, often presenting them as fact. Viral videos about Pan Am 914 or Brazil's Flight 513 thrive because they speak to universal fears and hopes. Each retelling adds another layer, ensuring the legends remain fresh even as aviation itself evolves. Psychology offers another reason ghost flights endure. They reconcile grief with hope. For families, imagining loved ones alive in another time is painful, but less unbearable than imagining them destroyed without trace. Skeleton crew stories, though macabre, still offer closure. The missing return, their fate visible. In this way, ghost flights are less about physics than about mourning. They endure because they offer narratives that soothe the wounds silence leaves open. Finally, ghost flights persist because they invite us to imagine. They are stories of thresholds, between sky and ground, life and and death, past and future. They allow us to wonder what might happen if time bent, if dimensions overlapped, if the sky itself opened into corridors we cannot see. Even skeptics who dismiss them as folklore cannot deny their narrative power. We may not believe in time slips, but we are drawn to the idea that the missing might still be out there, circling, waiting for a runway that will finally let them land. In the end, ghost flights endure because they are not really about planes. They are about us, our fear of erasure, our longing for continuity, our struggle to make sense of loss. They endure because they tell us what science cannot, that perhaps the vanished are not gone, but simply elsewhere. They endure because we need them to, because silence without story is too heavy to bear. And so as long as the skies remain vast, as long as aircraft vanish, and as long as grief demands meaning, ghost flight legends will circle above us. They will appear in headlines, in whispers, in the hush of control towers staring at impossible blips on their screens. They will remind us that the sky is not only a highway but a mystery, that every takeoff carries with it not just hope of arrival, but the shadow of disappearance. Ghost flights endure because they are the echoes of that shadow, stories we tell to remind ourselves that even in the silence of the skies, we are still listening for the sound of engines returning.